From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $50 million studio. I'm the Pro Wrestle Machine. Wrestling fans, it's time to lace up your boots and step into the squared circle. Tonight, we're delving deep into the Wrestling Observer newsletter dated May 18, 1998. In this issue, we have a major story that is sure to shake the wrestling world to its core. Eric Bischoff, the controversial figurehead of World Championship Wrestling, has issued a challenge to none other than Vince McMahon, the chairman of the World Wrestling Federation. Bischoff has called out McMahon to a fight, a showdown that could potentially change the landscape of professional wrestling forever. The tension between these two wrestling titans has been brewing for years, but it seems that things have finally reached boiling point. Will McMahon accept Bischoff's challenge? What could this fight mean for the future of WCW and the WWF? All this and more in the May 18, 1998 edition of the Wrestling Observer newsletter. Don't miss it. Now, through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. May 18, 1998 Wrestling Observer newsletter. Bischoff challenges McMahon to a fight. Tons more. By Observer staff. So the ante was upped once again, in a clever, if a little mistimed interview by Eric Bischoff. But in the end, even though this WWF versus WCW feud is a shoot, spare me any sob stories about right and wrong. Those are subjects for real life, where, contrary to the understanding of some people who are so close to wrestling as to actually believe it has something to do with real life, there really is a right and wrong. In pro wrestling, there are no morals, and in the end, might and right are usually mistaken for being the same thing. Yes, battles on the air between WWF and WCW are childish. But to dismiss them for that reason is to ignore the primary battleground television ratings. If you don't think childish battles are the way to go to draw ratings and drew more enthusiastic fans, then you don't understand the first thing about wrestling or television today. Better yet, tune into Phil Donahue this afternoon instead of Jerry Springer. Oh, you mean he isn't on anymore? So on Monday, under the rules this game is currently played under, the guy who was right was Vince McMahon. Next Monday it may be Eric Bischoff. Raw did a 4.72 rating and 7.05 share, the highest rating in its history in a head-to-head situation. Nitro did a 4.26 rating and 6.67 share, and more important for comparison's sake, a 4.14 over the head-to-head 2 hours, losing every quarter hour and realistically losing by nearly 0.6 of a point, the most significant ratings edge for the WWF in years. The Nitro replay did a 1.11 rating and 5.35 share. Who is right more often than wrong in the childish game of one-upmanship is probably going to also be the loser more often than not on Monday night. What made the May 11th battle so important is because there is no denying the WWF is on an ascending curve of interest. There is also no denying WCW business is remaining at an incredible level. Due to NBA playoffs the past 2 weeks, there has been no head-to-head battle after a series of weeks where Raw had the 2 highest ratings in its history. And this week we got the whole enchilada. Another Hulk Hogan-Randy Savage title match, which followed the formula that has been shown over the past few weeks that last week's record-breaking match is this week's outdated booking idea. And on the other side, Vince McMahon was in the ring as a wrestler and as a tag team partner for Steve Austin. And at the end, neither side set any records for their main events despite each going for the gold. In fact, the WWF's audience actually dropped in the final quarter hour, but it didn't drop enough to lose the quarter as the shows ended with Austin and McMahon as a tag team with 3,480,000 homes or a 4.72 rating, the same as its average for the entire 2 hours and actually one of the lower rated quarters of the entire Raw show. And Hogan vs. Savage with 3,239,000 homes, or a 4.42 rating, its second best quarter of the head-to-head period, with its highest quarter being a 4.5 for the angle where Giant joined Hogan's NWO and Chris Jericho did his angle with Joe Malenko. WWF's peak were a pair of 4.9 quarters, the one with the Sable Marrow and Undertaker Kane angles and the one where Dustin renounced Goldust and where the Mighty Munchkins, Kaientai, faced Terry Funk and 2 Cold Scorpio. But the real story wasn't what happened in either final quarter hour. WWF drew first blood hours before either show had even started, as they flew DX to Atlanta to try and embarrass WCW. They went to the WCW headquarters in Smyrna, Georgia. Hunter Hearst Helmsley made fun of not being able to read the private property, no trespassing sign and started filming some footage to try and embarrass the competition later that night. Apparently Nick Lombros called 911 to try and get them arrested for trespassing and lewd actions, and the police came, and while they weren't arrested, They were cited and detained for a few minutes to a half hour depending upon which story you believe. They also went to CNN for a completely lame skit where they asked to visit Ted Turner and their own camera people got scared and wouldn't film them. And the segment largely saw them hang out with a dozen fans on a lunch break crotch chopping themselves. As silly as this segment was, and as funny as the ones 2 weeks ago in Norfolk were, getting in your face is what fans today want because the only thing people know to be real in wrestling is the promotion war. As Paul Heyman showed first, and WWF is showing to an even greater level today, knocking the opposition and having them not respond may make the opposition feel like the other side is just coming off like whining losers and giving them publicity, and they're taking the high road. That may have been how the game is supposed to be played in tradition. But following tradition too much in an industry like this is a euphemism for being hopelessly out of touch. WCW has the most talented wrestlers by far. For most of the past 2 years until just these past few weeks, it had the most casual fans by far, for a time, and even this past Monday had the most vocal fans by far, and by sitting there and taking it, they had the least loyal fans of the three groups. The ante was up, both brilliantly and stupidly, by Bischoff early in the show. Bischoff came out on a huge bike and gloated about McMahon sending his wannabes to see him when they all know he isn't there since they know on Mondays he's at Nitro. He then said how Sean Waltman wanted an apology from him, said that Waltman was nothing but a little puppet for McMahon, told Waltman to bite me and claimed that he apologizes to no one. If this were the real world, the truth of the matter is that DX is just McMahon's puppets and their renegade gimmick is a marketing ploy. It's also true that in the real world, Bischoff clearly wronged Waltman and owes him an apology, but what the hell, in this business if you screw with someone no matter how wrong you are from a moral standpoint in real life, it isn't supposed to count even if the guy broke his neck in your ring, did nothing wrong and has a wife and a young child. By the rules the game is being played today, that doesn't count, and counts even less than that if the actions can be explained by saying he wasn't wrong to begin with if he gets more money in the end from someone else. So then we went from the pawns and the puppets of the game to the real players. Bischoff challenged McMahon to show up in Worcester and meet him in the ring. It was brilliant despite the whining the rest of the night both on the air and behind the scenes about it not being fair from those in WWF, the same reaction WCW had 2 weeks ago in Norfolk. He made it clear for people to not buy the pay-per-view thinking they're going to see that confrontation so nobody would construe it as false advertising, saying that McMahon wasn't going to show up and hinting if he did he'd knock him out. The fans, who hate the Bischoff character, realized quickly that this interview wasn't storyline and it was a shoot, and he got tremendous babyface pops for his speech from the sold-out throng in Kansas City, even if they knew later in the show when he came out to play Hill character with Hulk Hogan that it was back to fantasy and they easily booed him. But like the WWF fans at ringside who blindly cheered at WrestleMania in Anaheim at the lamest of billionaire Ted skits while the rest of the building shook their heads in bewilderment, now the WCW fans got a hero to stand up for the cause, not realizing just like WWF and ECW fans, that there is no cause. So we've got a 41-year-old man riding a bike in a leather jacket with dyed hair and a man who spent years getting his masculinity, or is it muscularity, from a steroid needle and even at 52, also with dyed hair, is strutting around in a sleeveless t-shirt 4 sizes too small acting as if he's tougher than all his wrestlers. Both are making themselves bigger stars than their employed entertainers, and, as it turns out both, McMahon in particular, are great performers in front of the camera. Bischoff was brilliant because McMahon won't be there in Worcester. By not being there, it means he's backed down from the challenge. Not in real life because it's all stupid to begin with, and of course everyone that needs to pretend whatever they need to pretend will pretend. He was also brilliant because the DX segments have now become obsolete. He positioned them as the messenger boys instead of the bad asses. Waltman's comeback on Raw telling Bischoff to suck it got a big pop live in Baltimore from fans who didn't know what Bischoff said in the first place, but it was an incredibly lame comeback and came off as pathetically transparent, albeit with a good delivery, in his trying to act like he's not a puppet of McMahon when the ante was already upped on the other show establishing him as a bit player in this game. Of course where Bischoff's brilliance turned into stupidity, at least for this week, was coming out at about 8:35 p.m. to make his speech instead of 2 hours later, which was probably responsible for enough of a swing vote to turn on to Raw to find out what the comeback was going to be. McMahon ignored it publicly, but his company sure didn't, which is the truer reaction. Jim Ross took jabs at WCW for the entire show, ripping on their headquarters in an industrial park in Smyrna, a cheap shot because the guys in the modest office have been kicking ass for the most part for the last 18 months, ripping on the total embarrassment to the industry that WCW's MTV special 2 days earlier, WCW had that one coming, was, and saying this wasn't the seniors tour, right after airing a match with 53-year-old Terry Funk and in the middle of a match with 52-year-old McMahon. Waltman said what he said. And Jim Cornette got in a few digs, first saying that it takes a lot of guts to challenge someone that you know isn't going to accept, which he's right about to that specific challenge, but ignores it was no more or less childish than what his own company has been doing, and second when Al Snow tried to get in the back door without a ticket, said, "This isn't WCW, it don't have free tickets," which is an unfair knock considering WWF had a little more than 1,000 comps at its TV tapings in the Baltimore arena, which on that night came just shy of selling out, and WCW had 549 comps in Kansas City in the larger Kemper Arena that was sold out. Besides Bischoff's timing, a few other reasons for the WWF ratings win, aside from the fact their storylines have been better for several weeks now, is that the Hogan-Savage match wasn't finalized until late in the second hour, and thus WCW announcers had nothing stronger than Chris Benoit versus Booker T, which has no casual fan interest to plug, while WWF announcers had a lot more exciting things to talk about later in the show on their plate. Not to mention Benoit and T had an angle that was a total embarrassment building it up. WCW, which needs to provide stronger wrestling to win the night because they can't win trying soap opera because they just aren't organized enough when it comes to long-term booking, rolled out one squash match after another. Oh yeah, and there was the storyline stuff. Hogan pinned Savage when Bret KO'd Savage with the title belt. But Roddy Piper showed up and reversed the decision and announced he's going to ref when Bret faces Randy on the pay-per-view. Giant, who joined Hulk's NWO, showed up, Nash's NWO showed up to fight them, Sting hung out in the rafters, everyone was fighting everyone for no apparent reason, and the show ended with no explanation given as to what the main event will be on a pay-per-view 6 days later. On the other show, Vince, who hates Austin, teamed with Austin against The Rock and D-Lo. Austin never tagged out, and thank God he didn't because they were having a tremendously well-timed brawl before finally Vince clotheslined him. It wasn't the seniors tour, but you could have fooled me watching Gerald Briscoe, 52, and Pat Patterson, 58, put the boots to Cold Stone. Austin made his own comeback until Dude Love showed up, which brought Dustin, "Honest, I'm straight again, please cheer me," and not only that, "I miss my wife and kid and even my dad, and it's all Vince's fault." Rhodes out, and DX out, and everyone was fighting everyone for some apparent reason. What about the most important question of the week? Who would win if they really fought? I mean, Eric's got the martial arts training, but Vince is huge. But Eric's younger and quicker and knows how to deliver and punch and a kick. But Vince is huge. And Eric does have a gut. And Vince is constantly lifting weights and is still huge. But Bret flattened Vince with one punch. But Vince let him do it, and he's still huge. Believe me, within wrestling on Tuesday, that was the most talked about piece of conversation. In the WCW offices, the story is that Eric, who has fought real fights in real rings against real people, would humiliate Vince in rapid order. In the WWF offices, Vince's wound ended quickly because he's a tough street fighter from the other side of the tracks, and that martial arts stuff doesn't mean a thing. And while following traditional rules does make one outdated today in this business, there is also one constant historically about promotional wars and how they ultimately end and what happens when the big showdown finally takes place. Remember not all that many years ago when Lou Thesz got the UWFI guys and the reporters to go to New Japan headquarters and embarrass them in a grandstand challenge because in a real fight Takada could take Chono. And ultimately, how did that fight with New Japan and UWFI end? The same way as Lawler and Savage when they were in their promotional war in Tennessee, and everyone else dating back to the final shooting match in history, which was anything but, where Strangler Lewis finally put over Jim Londos. The guy who wins every time in this game when it comes to the final shooting match is the guy who can still sign the checks when the other side's checkbook taps out. A few weeks back, Randy Savage did the interview basically portraying the old school veteran point of view as if the new stars of today, and in specific, Bret Hart, his rival on an upcoming pay-per-view match, as never having proven themselves as money draws, which of course becomes really stupid today since the business is generating more money than at any time in its history. It got me thinking about something we've done before, and I guess it was time to do again. When it comes to the WWF champion, who really did put asses in the seats and whose title reigns were and weren't successful when it comes to drawing television ratings, we're going to limit this to WWF because over the years the WCW championship has generally not been defended on the majority of house shows, nor has the title match been the main event almost every time out as it is with the WWF title, nor the key personality when it comes to drawing television ratings. That in some cases also is true with the WWF champion, but more often than not the champion is who the company during that time period was built around. The WWF champion by and large defended the title at most of the house shows, or at least was the key headliner, particularly in the major arenas, and his match was probably 95% of the time the main event and key drawing match on the shows. We've been keeping pretty accurate WWF records dating back to January of 1992. After giving the raw data, which will say whatever it says, we'll try again to put a face on the numbers. The average attendance per show and average television rating would be the figure during the period the person is the champion. The time frame average would be the average for the period 6 months prior to the title reign and 6 months after, so we can compare how the champion himself changed or didn't change business from what it was doing at that point in WWF history. Because we don't have 1991 records, when it comes to Ric Flair's reign, the time frame would only be the 6 months after he lost the title the first time, and since Steve Austin's reign is still going and is less than 6 months in, for Shawn Michaels we are only going a few months after and 6 months before, and Austin's time frame is only 6 months before since there is no after. First, let's look at attendance in the period both before and after the man won the title, and the comparison percentages basically all things being equal, and they never truly are, but this is as good as it's going to get. How good or bad the person drew in comparison to what during that time period they should have been expected to draw. From January 19, 1992, to April 5, 1992, Ric Flair was the champion with an average attendance of 6,503 and a 76.2% increase in attendance. Randy Savage was the champion from April 5, 1992, to September 1, 1992, with an average attendance of 3,772 and a decrease of 13.4%. Ric Flair reclaimed the championship from September 1, 1992, to October 12, 1992, with an average attendance of 3,295 and a decrease of 13.9%. Bret Hart became the champion from October 12, 1992, to April 4, 1993, with an average attendance of 3,432 and a decrease of 4.9%. From April 4, 1993 to June 13, 1993, Hulk Hogan was the champion with an average attendance of 3,153 and a decrease of 10.6%. Yokozuna held the championship from June 13, 1993 to March 20, 1994, with an average attendance of 3,481 and an increase of 8.2%. Bret Hart once again became the champion from March 20, 1994 to November 23, 1994, with an average attendance of 3,020 and a decrease of 4.9%. Kevin Nash held the championship from November 26, 1994 to November 19, 1995, with an average attendance of 2,935 and a decrease of 27.1%. Bret Hart won the championship again from November 19, 1995 to March 31, 1996, with an average attendance of 5,186 and an increase of 34.9%. Shawn Michaels became the champion from March 31, 1996 to November 17, 1996, with an average attendance of 4,690 and a decrease of 4.0%. Psycho Sid held the championship from November 17, 1996 to January 19, 1997, with an average attendance of 5,172 and an increase of 2.9%. Shawn Michaels regained the championship from January 19, 1997 to February 13, 1997, with an average attendance of 4,633 and a decrease of 9.8%. Psycho Sid once again held the championship from February 17, 1997 to March 23, 1997, with an average attendance of 5,678 and an increase of 14.7%. From March 23, 1997 to August 3, 1997, Undertaker was the champion with an average attendance of 5,719 and an increase of 3.8%. Bret Hart held the championship from August 3, 1997 to November 9, 1997, with an average attendance of 5,817 and a decrease of 14.9%. Shawn Michaels became the champion once again from November 9, 1997 to March 29, 1998, with an average attendance of 7,101 and an increase of 3.4%. Finally, Steve Austin became the champion from March 29, 1998 to May 1, 1998, with an average attendance of 8,851 and an increase of 46.6%. From January 1, 1992 to May 1, 1998, the overall ranking of champions as drawing cards was determined based on their average attendance during their respective reigns. Steve Austin was the top-ranked champion with an average attendance of 8,851 and an increase of 46.6%. The Undertaker was the second-ranked champion with an average attendance of 5,719 and an increase of 3.8%. Psycho Sid was ranked third with an average attendance of 5,341 and an increase of 6.8%. Ric Flair was ranked fourth with an average attendance of 5,220 and a significant increase of 39.4%. Shawn Michaels was ranked fifth with an average attendance of 4,906 and a slight decrease of 3.6%. Bret Hart was ranked sixth with an average attendance of 4,063 and a slight decrease of 1.0%. Randy Savage was ranked seventh with an average attendance of 3,772 and a decrease of 13.4%. Yokozuna was ranked eighth with an average attendance of 3,481 and an increase of 6.5%. Hulk Hogan was ranked ninth with an average attendance of 3,153 and a decrease of 10.6%. Finally, Kevin Nash was ranked 10th with an average attendance of 2,935 and a significant decrease of 27.1%. The most important thing these figures show is that in most cases, and Steve Austin right now may or may not be the exception, it is business patterns at the time, and now who is on top that is more important than who holds the title and who is headlining the shows. Austin is the only WWF champion of the past 6.5 years who has made business considerably stronger than it should have been expected to be based on the time frame. On paper it looks like Ric Flair also did that, and Bret Hart did in his third title reign, but overall the 4 times, not included the one-day deal, Hart held the title. Business was almost exactly as it should have been. Hart was neither a good draw or a bad draw as WWF champion, but he drew what should have been expected as champion. The same can be said for Shawn Michaels. The only drew bad draws as champion were Randy Savage, and really that was a weird period in history and he isn't to blame for that. Hulk Hogan, which was a miscalculation at the time and who was a great draw at other periods, and Kevin Nash, who was a bad draw as champion. Flair's first title reign was just before the period the bottom dropped out, which makes his first reign in particular an overall figure look stronger than it really was, not to mention that during the first reign it was really Hogan, and not Flair, who was the real drawing card and realistically should be given credit for the impressive figures. Yokozuna's title reign, while at a bad period, did better business than they were doing at that time. While the WWF scandal period actually started in 1992 at about the same time, actually about 2 weeks before Flair won the title, it didn't really kick into gear until late March, and the big names, Hogan in particular since he was the most important, didn't stop dropping out until after WrestleMania, which was the same day that Savage beat Flair for the title. The big drop from Flair to Savage as champion had a lot more to do with the situation having nothing to do with Flair and Savage, although it was a mistake at that particular point in time to make the change that early because the psychology of Flair chasing Savage with the angle the way it was all wrong. But the business drop-off would have occurred anyway. Putting the title back on Flair later in the year saw attendance continue to drop, and it remained at a low point until the end of 1995. The WWF building again around the scandal magnate Hogan in the summer of 1993 actually saw business decline from the previous reign of Hart and the follow-up reign of Yokozuna. The pickup had a lot more to do with the business in all facets starting to rebound after 3.5 years due to renewed interest in wrestling in general created by the Monday Night Wars, although it can't be argued that Bret Hart was also a much bigger draw as champion than Diesel. Having said all that, these figures do end several myths. The first being that Flair wasn't a success at the box office as WWF champion. The second being that Sid was a box office failure as champion, when in actuality he was a success as a draw as compared with the better working Michaels during the same time period, in particular the early 1997 reign by Michaels, who had the benefit of being champion during wrestling's hot winter season, and there was a noticeable drop-off in attendance after he beat Sid at the Alamodome. The third is that Hart is unproven as a draw. He was not a draw his first 2 reigns, but was a huge draw in his third title reign. His fourth reign looks bad when it comes to time frame because business exploded after he left, but business was doing great with him on top all summer and fall. And the final myth is anyone who would claim that anyone but the present-day Austin is the biggest drawing card as champion of this decade. Now let's look at television ratings. The TV ratings of champions from January 19, 1992 to May 1, 1998 were analyzed based on the average rating of their respective championship reigns. Ric Flair held the championship from January 19, 1992 to April 5, 1992 with a rating of 2.53 and an increase of 19.3%. Randy Savage held the championship from April 5, 1992 to September 1, 1992 with a rating of 2.16 and a slight increase of 1.9%. Ric Flair regained the championship from September 1, 1992 to October 12, 1992
with a rating of 1.80 and a decrease of 14.7%.
Bret Hart held the championship from October 12, 1992 to April 4, 1993, with a rating of 1.98. Hulk Hogan held the championship from April 4, 1993 to June 13, 1993, with a rating of 2.03 and a slight increase of 2.0%. Yokozuna held the championship from June 13, 1993 to March 20, 1994, with a rating of 2.09 and an increase of 5.6%. Bret Hart won the championship again from March 20, 1994 to November 23, 1994, with a rating of 1.94 and a decrease of 9.3%. Kevin Nash held the championship from November 26, 1994 to November 19, 1995, with a rating of 2.00 and a slight increase of 2.0%. Bret Hart won the championship again from November 19, 1995 to March 31, 1996, with a rating of 1.93 and a slight increase of 2.1%. Shawn Michaels held the championship from March 31, 1996 to November 17, 1996, with a rating of 1.76 and an increase of 6.3%. Psycho Sid held the championship from November 17, 1996 to January 19, 1997, with a rating of 1.30 and a significant decrease of 21.7%.
Shawn Michaels regained the championship from January 19, 1997 to February 13, 1997, with a rating of 1.40 and a decrease of 13.6%.
Psycho Sid held the championship again from February 17, 1997 to March 23, 1997, with a rating of 1.50 and a decrease of 8.5%.
Undertaker held the championship from March 23, 1997 to August 3, 1997, with a rating of 1.80 and an increase of 6.5%.
Bret Hart held the championship again from August 3, 1997 to November 9, 1997, with a rating of 1.98.
Shawn Michaels won the championship again from November 9, 1997 to March 29, 1998, with a rating of 2.05 and a decrease of 2.8%.
Finally, Steve Austin held the championship from March 29, 1998 to May 1, 1998, with a rating of 2.50 and a significant increase of 40.0%. From January 1, 1992 to May 1, 1998, the overall ranking of champions as TV ratings draws was determined based on the average rating of their respective championship reigns. Steve Austin was the top-ranked champion with an average TV rating of 2.50 and a significant increase of 40.0%.
Ric Flair was ranked second with an average TV rating of 2.24 and an increase of 5.7%. Randy Savage was ranked third with an average TV rating of 2.16 and a slight increase of 1.9%.
Yokozuna was ranked fourth with an average TV rating of 2.09 and an increase of 5.6%.
Hulk Hogan was ranked fifth with an average TV rating of 2.03 and a slight increase of 2.0%.
Kevin Nash was ranked sixth with an average TV rating of 2.00 and a slight increase of 2.0%. Bret Hart was ranked seventh with an average TV rating of 1.96 and a decrease of 3.0%.
Undertaker was ranked eighth with an average TV rating of 1.80 and an increase of 6.5%. Shawn Michaels was ranked ninth with an average TV rating of 1.78 and an increase of 6.6%.
Psycho Sid was ranked last with an average TV rating of 1.37 and a significant decrease of 17.0%. While Austin looks good in both polls, we do see, as mentioned before, difference when it comes to ratings draws and house show draws. The most notable is the short reigns of Psycho Sid, which were successful at the box office, but were flops when it comes to TV ratings.
And while Undertaker was second from the top as a drawing card as champion, he was near the bottom when it came to television ratings when he was the key figure.
Michaels is in the middle as a draw, but near the bottom when it came to ratings, although from his time frame you can see he actually did better than what he probably should have done, and it was more of coming along at the wrong time to draw ratings, unlike Sid, who was a bona fide disaster in that way. The other interesting note is that while Kevin Nash was a disaster as champion at the box office, he was not a disaster as champion in the slightest when it came to drawing ratings.
As mentioned before, ratings and drawing money at the box office are two different animals, often entirely different, and this period is rare in that all facets of business are booming at the same time.
It is also interesting to note that while we talk about record ratings all the time, the ratings with Austin as champion, while great, are less than those the company was drawing in early 1992, and that was before Monday Night Raw even existed, and the flagship show was that stale-taped prime-time wrestling.
In the interest of realism as opposed to absolute accuracy, Austin's period of champion is actually being figured from January 15, 1998, when Michael stopped working house shows in Austin, even though he didn't actually win the title until March 29, was clearly the top drawing card in the company and was headlining all the house shows in that capacity. Realistically, Austin may have been the top drawing card dating back much farther than that, arguably since WrestleMania, although it was Bret vs. Undertaker that headlined most of the arena shows during both the Undertaker and Bret title reigns.
Japanese television rundown. April 26th Pancrase.
This was a live pay-per-view show. Overall, I'd have to give it a thumbs down.
Some of the matches were interesting defensive battles and they all appeared to be shoots. But it was almost like watching a series of 0-0 soccer matches with no close shots on goal being decided by penalty kicks. None of the matches were great, although the main event was a pretty impressive performance by both men when it came to stamina, and a few of the matches were downright boring. Because so many of the matches went the time limit, the pay-per-view show lasted 4 hours and 15 minutes, which also didn't help us to have a show last that long. It had better be outstanding. It's amazing the evolution of the product. 5 years ago when Pancrase and UFC debuted, almost all the matches lasted 2 minutes or less and ended spectacularly. Originally, one of the reasons they worked some Pancrase matches early and working in the early days often just consisted of Suzuki, Funaki or Shamrock simply carrying their foes several minutes before beating them, was simply so they could put on a show that lasted more than 20 minutes. Now that the fighters are trained and experienced, the Pancrase matches generally go the time limit. 1. Satoshi Hasegawa beat Ikuiza Minowa with 2 judges ruling him the winner, and the third calling it a draw after 10 minutes regulation and 3 minutes overtime. Mainly standing early with lots of palms to the face. Hasegawa knocked Minowa down with a palm and got on top, although Minowa managed a reversal when Hasegawa tried a submission. In the overtime, Hasegawa got the mount and began throwing palm blows which bloodied up Minowa's nose. It was a typical Pancrase-style match. Hasegawa deserved the decision, but he didn't dominate Minowa. 2. Asami Shibuya beat Takaku Fuke by unanimous decision after 10 minutes regulation and 3 minutes overtime. An uneventful match. Both went for submissions and never really came close. Shibuya deserved the win. 3. Adrian Serrano beat Kyuma Kunyoku in an upset with 2 judges ruling for Serrano and the third ruling a draw after 10 minutes regulation and 3 minutes overtime. Serrano, who has fought in the US for Extreme Challenge, appeared to have about a 20-pound weight advantage and used it to be dominant on the ground. Kunyoku went for a guillotine, but Serrano punched his way out. In the overtime, Serrano got the mount and started throwing palm blows down until Kunyoku was bleeding from the nose. This was a fairly close fight, although Serrano probably pulled it out in overtime. 4. Semi-Schilt beat Jason Godzi in 147. Godzi made the same mistake he made against Ryushi Yanagisawa earlier this year. He shot in once and Schilt nearly got a guillotine, but Godzi powered out. He shot in again, and the same thing happened, this time with Godzi getting dominant position after powering out. After a stand-up, he shot in again, Schilt timed it and threw a knee to the temple. Godzi wasn't stopped by the knee and managed by take Schilt down, but was bleeding like his head exploded, and the referee saw all the blood and called for the doctor, who took a look at the cut and stopped the fight. 5. Minoru Suzuki beat Tony Rojo via unanimous decision after 10 minutes regulation and 3 minutes overtime. Really boring match. Both fought on their feet cautiously with some blows landing, but mainly circling away from each other. Rojo was more aggressive early, but after regulation, it was one of those matches that neither deserved to win. In the overtime, they remained on their feet and Suzuki did have a good flurry of slaps and kicks to the more tired Rojo just before the end, which was enough to give him the decision. It probably should have been a draw. 6. Ryushi Yanagisawa beat Jason DeLucia in 12:44. DeLucia scored first with an open hand blow which knocked Yanagisawa down. He came very close on the mat to getting a choke, and how Yanagisawa escaped is beyond me. This was probably boring to an average fan, but it was a good technical ground match with both constantly working and moving, trying to get a submission, including a period where both were going for the ankle at the same time. Yanagisawa after a scramble got the ankle lock and DeLucia tapped like crazy immediately. 7. Yuki Kondo beat Keiichiro Yamamiya with 2 judges giving him the win and the other calling it a draw after 20 minutes regulation. This match was almost all on the ground with both men constantly trying stuff. Also a good technical match, but not all that exciting. Pretty close match, but Kondo did have an edge. 8. Guy Mesger won the King of Pancrase title from Masakatsu Funaki via unanimous decision after 30 minutes.
Actually, the best part of the show was Mesger's interview before the match, putting over Funaki and the Cop title.
Mesger said that he's fought everywhere in the world and that Pancrase has the toughest fighters and the champion of Pancrase is the only true free fighting champion. He said, "I could be wrong about that, but I'm not." This also wasn't super exciting, but was one of those matches that you had to be impressed with as both went at a strong pace for 30 minutes with no breaks. Mesger got a yellow card for an accidental knee to the groin about 2.30 inches. Most of the match consisted of Mesger bullying Funaki into the corner and connecting with lots of body shots, some open hands to the head and some punches to the thigh. The story about Funaki being really sick sounded legit because he really couldn't do much of anything, although he also did little in his previous match against Shield. It could be the wear and tear of all the years of fighting and pro wrestling taking their toll, as he's been doing this since he's 15 and his prime may be behind him. Funaki got one yellow card, although it wasn't evident as to why. He then accidentally kicked Mesger low, getting a second yellow. Mesger again backed him into the corner and battered him, eventually cutting his right eye open. Mesger went after the cut with open hands and knees before Funaki took him to the ground. The ref ordered a stand-up pretty quick. They had a strong exchange about 17 minutes in before Mesger continued with the body shots.
A series of open hands and knees put Funaki down at 19 minutes.
After a stand-up, they had another good exchange until Mesger trapped Funaki in the corner with more body and thigh shots until Funaki scored a takedown at 21 minutes, but they quickly rolled to the ropes. Mesger then took Funaki down and Funaki went for the ankle, but Mesger blocked it and eventually Mesger backed off and let Funaki up. He punished him on their feet the rest of the way. Mesger looked very impressive. As it sounds, the match was almost totally one-sided. May 3rd, All Japan. 1. Toshiaki Kawada beat Mitsuharu Misawa in 28:05 to win the Triple Crown. Lord James Blears, who has been the figurehead president of the Pacific Wrestling Federation since the inception of this office in 1972, was back reading the proclamation before the main event. Blears is another of the former wrestlers who is living the flip side of all the years of poundings in his various physical endeavors such as wrestling and surfing, and was having a lot of trouble walking.
Kawada came in the best condition of his career, having dropped about 20 pounds, being tanned and even showing abs, although even in shape he still has that funky-looking body that would make them try to run him off without a second thought if he were to show up at the next tryouts at the power plant. Misawa, also lighter than usual, was moving like he was held together with string. The match started out slow and it was evident in every movement how badly hurt Misawa was. Because of Misawa's injuries, the body of the match was more slow-paced than usual as he was doing a lot of selling, and the Dome is a hard building for that style, and most for that matter because sound doesn't travel to get over. Just because of the psychology and big finish, this probably would have been a match of the year candidate had it taken place in another building. In comparison to their 30 minutes draw 1 month earlier, this was slower paced and Misawa was a lot livelier and better in the previous bout, but this was better for psychology and built to the finish better, so overall the two matches were pretty much equal but very different matches. Kawada dominated early, with Misawa getting in trademark moves like his elbow suicida and a drop kick off the top early. At one point Kawada went to deliver a superplex, but Misawa flipped in midair and landed on his feet, but in doing so began selling his bad knee, and Kawada hit a brainbuster on Misawa's bad neck for a big pop. Kawada was taking it easy on the kicks to the body compared to usual. It was hard to see the spot where Misawa broke Kawada's rib. The early portion saw flurries of great exchanges but also slow spots. After Kawada dropped Misawa on his head, the match exploded. Misawa, whose trademark is wrestling without facial expressions, actually sold like Ric Flair when trapped in a figure four on his bad knee and going to the ropes. The last few minutes of the match were excellent, with Kawada basically destroying Misawa with awesome flurries and great crowd heat, with the crowd going nuts when Misawa kicked out of a brainbuster and the first power bomb before getting pinned with the second one. 4 1/4 stars. 2. Kenta Kobashi and Johnny Ace beat Vader and Stan Hansen in 22:05. Hansen in particular got an incredible reaction coming out. Kobashi and Vader carried the match and worked most of the way. Vader worked very hard, but he was really heavy and got tired toward the finish. Kobashi was awesome as you'd figure given it was the biggest show of his career. Hansen tried, and for that matter, so did Ace, but Hansen is very limited in what he can still do and Ace just isn't any good. At one point Kobashi even did a plancha on Vader. First big pop was a combination back suplex and Ace Crusher double team move on Vader. Ace was looking bad on offense, but Vader cut him off and really clocked him with a lariat. When Hansen was in with Ace, Hansen whipped him into a table and dropped the table on him.
Vader splashed Ace and used a clothesline off the top on him for near falls. Ace got the Ace Crusher on Vader, but Hansen saved him. Kobashi hit a moonsault on Vader and got up and lariated Hansen. He went for a suplex on Vader, Hansen saved Vader, and Vader landed on Kobashi. They used a stuffed power bomb on Kobashi. Hansen tagged in and went for an elbow drop off the top rope. Hansen actually slipped on the ropes, but luckily this is one move you can do that on and have it still look just as effective, maybe more so because he came off like he was dropping with so much dead weight. Finally they did the spot where Vader crashed into Hansen when Kobashi moved, and first Kobashi got a near fall on Hansen with a schoolboy, before then taking him down in an inside cradle for the pin. 3 3/4 stars. Puerto Rico. El Nene won the Universal title from Rey Gonzalez on April 29 in Garabo. This appears to be setting up a feud between Gonzalez, who has never worked as a heel, against Carlos Colon. Gonzalez did a heelish interview on Colon since Colon talked about the mistakes Gonzalez made in the match where he lost the title. They announced that the Fabulous Freebirds, which would be Terry Gordy and Michael Hope, would be coming in to challenge Ricky Santana and Glamour Boy Shane, but the Freebirds again didn't arrive. Jungle Jim Steele, All Japan's Wolf Hockfield, was scheduled to return and also feud with Colon in between tours. Mexico. We don't have a lot of details, but it appears the Promo Azteca organization is sinking fast due to having no television exposure. Thus far we haven't heard of anyone officially leaving, but it has been suggested they may have their wrestlers work either with AAA or EMLL. Sonny Wanu is scheduled for a meeting with Paco Alonso trying to counter the WWF's deal with EMLL. The most recent lineups we have are for May 1st. For the EMLL at Arena Coliseo, it was Atlantis and Emilio Charles Jr. and Ultimo Dragon versus El Hijo del Santo and Dr. Wagner Jr. and Blue Panther, La Fiera and Pantera and Tigre Blanco versus Bestia Salvaje and Black Warrior and Violencia and Yoshihiro Tajiri and Tony Rivera and Solar 2 versus Angel Blanco Jr. and El Hijo del Gladiador and Dr. O'Borman Jr. Ultimo Dragon's proteges Tokyo Magnum, Judo Suwa and Shimo Nobunaga, who appeared in a great six-man on Nitro several weeks back, worked on the undercard. For Azteca and Nezahualcóyotl it was Kanan and La Parca and Lizmark Sr. versus Silver King and El Texano and Dandy, Zorro and Super Parca and Salcero and Venom Black versus Los Villanos 4 and 5 and Juventud Guerrera and Damian and Oro Jr. and Super Colo and versus El Hijo del Diablo and Halloween and Jurassico. The major AAA show of that week was April 30th in Aguascalientes, headlined by Pero Aguayo and Pero Aguayo Jr. and Mascara Sagrada versus Cibernetico and The Killer and Abismo Negro, a Mexican national tag team title match with champions Fuerza Guerrera and Mosco de la Merced versus Octagon and Pentagon, and a hair versus hair match with Oscar Sevilla versus Mohicano. The next Tijuana is May 16th at Auditorio Municipal for Promociones de Sosa with La Parca and Mascara Sagrada and Super Parca versus Psicosis and Jerry Estrada and Damien, Rey Mysterio versus Kiss and US versus Mexican Rudos with Pero Russo, isn't he supposed to be Russian? And Cincinnati Red and American Maniac versus El Hijo del Enfermero and Medico Asesino Jr. and Halloween. They're building to a Mysterio, now a heel, versus Kiss Hair versus Mask match for the summer. All Japan. The actual attendance for the Tokyo Dome show was 58,300. We had been given a report with transposed digits last week, and judging from TV angles and photos in all the magazines, that figure looked to be legitimate, and it was said there was virtually no paper out. The building was 98% packed with the exception of the outfield seats, which went unsold. The Babas made a ton of money on the show as the gate was estimated at around $4 million. NTV paid both the building and production expenses, so all that the Babas had to pay was for the talent. From that standpoint, the show has to be considered a huge success, and there is little doubt they'll do another one next year. As many felt would end up happening, and does seem to happen with a lot of Dome shows, even when people aren't happy with the lineup, when the show gets close, it becomes such an event that people decide to attend. The audience was said to be really hardcore, as a lot of even longtime fans and reporters were shocked how into the subtle mannerisms the crowd was, but also historical. Witness the huge reaction that Stan Hansen, Jumbo Tsuruta and even Rusher Kimura received for their spots out of the past. The Dome show will end up making up 6 weeks of television, so I don't believe they'll even be doing taping until the June 12th Budokan show. The only match announced for the next Budokan is Toshiaki Kawada versus Kenta Kobashi for the Triple Crown. The original plan was for Kawada to be given a win over Jun Akiyama on his first defense, but I guess with Mitsuharu Misawa off the tour in the show, they felt with the big draw absent and coming off a dome show that they needed to put on their strongest possible drawing match.
The other big show of the tour is June 5th in Sapporo with Kawada and Akira Taue defending the double tag titles against Kobashi and Johnny Ace. Steve Williams vs. Jun Akiyama. Akiyama has never beaten Williams in a singles match, and since this is Williams' last major singles match with the promotion,
one would expect Akiyama to get his win, and Gary Albright and Yoshihiro Takayama vs. Takao Mori and Tamon Honda. Masahito Kakihara blew out his right knee at the Dome show and is also at this tour, which is why Takayama is doing a lot of teaming with Albright. The other title match on the tour is May 31st in Funabashi with Johnny Smith and Wolf Hockfield defending the All-Asian Tag Team titles against Takao Mori and Tamon Honda.
The new tour starts May 23rd at Korakuen Hall with Kawada and Taue and Tsuyoshi Kikuchi vs. Kobashi and Ace and Satoru Asako, Albright and Takayama vs. Akiyama and Masafuchi, Smith and Hockfield vs. Amori and Kentaro Shiga. Yoshinari Ogawa is also supposed to return on this tour from his broken leg. There at press time hadn't even been negotiations opened up between this group and WWF regarding Vader being available for the tag team tournament. April 26th TV show did a 2.2 rating. New Japan. Since there has been almost no news in Japan over the past week, Nikkei Sports, one of the major daily sports newspapers, reported on May 12th that Tatsumi Fujinami would be retiring soon. The big item is that Fujinami basically said that his June 5th title defense against Shinya Hashimoto would be the final championship match of his career. He didn't say when he would officially retire, but said that he wasn't going to retire on a major dome show like Riki Choshu and Antonio Inoki, but that he wanted his last match to be held in a small town because he wanted it to be just like his debut. Fujinami, 44, debuted as a 17-year-old protege of Inoki on May 9, 1971 and got his first push as WWF World Junior Heavyweight Champion in 1978. He was the perennial number 2 babyface in the company for most of the next 10 years, a golden age of sorts for Japanese wrestling since it was broadcast in network primetime and did huge ratings. And he was a key part of it, first as Junior Heavyweight Champion, then as International Champion where he had his famous feud with Choshu, and finally as IWGP Champion, which he held a record-setting 5 times, including currently winning the title from Kensuke Sasaki on the Inoki Farewell Show. As we've mentioned many times, one of the main reasons Choshu retired was to set an example because wanted to start phasing out the older wrestlers from the company to allow the younger guys to have their time to create their own legends rather than be held back because they didn't have the name value from the years of exposure that the older wrestlers had. It's a very gutsy policy when you're dealing with a winning team, and it's easy to stay with the pat hand rather than rebuild the team when it's on top. Just as an example of this, Kunyaki Kobayashi, the longtime mid-carder, who does have a big name in Japan among the generation that drew up while he was in his prime feuding with the 2 Tiger Masks, Satoru Sayama and Mitsuharu Misawa, is basically getting $350,000 per year for the next 2 years with the idea that he has to save the money because it's the last 2 years of his active career, and no doubt several others past 40, if not most, are in the same basic boat. Speaking of Sasaki, they are doing an angle with him as kind of a lone wolf type, where he is breaking away from the New Japan group. There is still no evidence of what the end result is of the relationship with WCW. The NWO name is still being used, but it seems to be fading more by the week. The only foreigners booked on the next tour are Felino and Dr. Wagner Jr. from EMLL, and Big Titan and Michael Wall Street, neither of whom are booked through WCW. Fry will wrestle Yoshiaki Fujiwara on the June 5th Budokan Hall show. Actually, most of the behind-the-scenes speculation in Japan revolves around Inoki. The Hiwato Sports Peace, political party that Inoki formed and put on the map as a senator, had not been heard of since Inoki lost in the 1995 election. Anyway, somehow the party was back in the news as Inoki worked some sort of an angle telling people that he was going to get Muhammad Ali and Arnold Schwarzenegger to campaign for it, and Yumiko Hata will be running in the 1998 election on that ticket, and then after reviving the party and having backers set it up, Inoki moved to Los Angeles with his wife and son where he bought a condo. However, he still seems to show up in Japan about every 2 weeks. Inoki has told people he's living in the US so he could spend time on his hobbies like golf and gardening, and get away from fans who mob him on every street corner. The UFO gimmick will actually start at the New Japan Yokohama Arena show on September 23rd. Instead of establishing UFO as a separate promotion and then feud with New Japan,
they'll actually be debuting as part of the New Japan show, which tells you the company isn't going to as great lengths as they probably would need to in 1998, since this angle has been done to death in Japan, to get it over.
On that show they'll have the judo rematch with Naoya Ogawa versus Rafael Kubatuki, who is the 6'8.5", 290-pound former world judo champion.
They are trying to harden up Ogawa's physique because he's got that smooth physique that most super heavyweight wrestlers and judo players have but isn't marketable in most cases to wrestling fans.
He's doing this deal where he fasts 3 days per week to drop weight, and thus far has gone from 281 pounds down to 266.
Anyone who knows anything about training and dieting will tell you that is the stupidest method known to mankind for trying to drop weight. Keiji Muto is now scheduled to return after surgeries to both knees on July 14th in Sapporo. April 25th TV show did a 2.9 rating. Other Japan notes. Rings on May 29th at Sapporo Nakajima Sports Center has Kiyoshi Tamura vs. Bitsade Teriel for the Rings World Heavyweight title, Tsuyoshi Kosuha vs. Folk Han, Ilya Kine Mikhail vs. Masayuki Naruse, Yup Castel vs. Gram Zaza, Wataru Sakata vs. Kenichi Yamamoto, and Hiromitsu Kanehara vs. Leo Hasdell. It is not a definite that Tamura will be ready since he really took a beating in his last fight, against Valentin Overeem, which apparently was a shoot. Still haven't seen the tape.
Teriel is god-awful, like a Russian Jim Duggan, but he's well over 300 pounds, and probably the most amazing performance of Tamura's career was carrying that slug to a fantastic match last year.
K1 on May 24th in Fukuoka has something of a letdown of a show with Masaki Sadake vs. Musashi as the main event, plus Mike Bernardo vs. Ray Sefo, Jerome Lebenner vs. Combat Gio, Ernest Hust vs. Jean Riviere, and Vander Merva vs. Takeru. Pancrase ran May 12th at Korakuen Hall before a sellout 2,100 with Semi-Schultz beating Yoshiki Takahashi when the ref stopped the match in 5:44 in the main event. Masakatsu Funaki missed the show because his eye hasn't healed up since the matches with Schultz and Guy Mesger. At the show, Ryushi Yanagisawa challenged Mesger to a title match for the next major show, which will be September 14th at Budokan Hall, which will be a pay-per-view, which is a terribly weak title match for Budokan if that's what ends up happening. Atsushi Onita Zen ran a big show on May 5th in Wakayama, with the main event being a World Street Fight 6-man tag title match under 4 corners rules with Team No Respect, Hiromichi Fuyuki and Haido and Yukihiro Kanemura, winning the titles from Onita and Koji Nakagawa and Tetsuhiro Kuroda. Haido replaced Mr. Ganasuke on the TNR team since Ganasuke suffered a back injury on April 28th, and then blew out his knee in his pay-per-view match against Hayabusa on April 30th, and will be out for about 3 months.
After the match they tied Onita up with chains and did the ECW crucifixion gimmick. It's all part of a major confusing angle where Onita was supposed to break up Zen because his team lost, but Shoichi Arai, the figurehead FMW president, wants Onita to work the upcoming house show. Sogo Ito, the former ref who turned heel doing the Nick Patrick gimmick, made Arai lick at his sweaty boots. The gimmick now is that Zen must beat Team No Respect on all 3 shows on May 25th on Oita, May 26th in Kuna, and May 31st in Kanazawa, or break up. Arai and Onita said they wouldn't lick the boots, but they'd bite their toes off. Also on the show, Hayabusa and Masato Tanaka retained their World Brass Knucks tag titles, beating Geto and Jado. An update on the pay-per-view scene, because people from the US who think pay-per-view in US terms don't seem to understand where the technology is today in Japan.
DirecTV, which broadcasts FMW Intergen pay-per-view events, and probably will do Michinoku Pro shows in the future, is only in 50,000 homes in all of Japan. There is no money to be made at the present time for these companies in doing pay-per-view from buy rates and buys. DirecTV buys the shows from the promoters as a loss leader incentive to get wrestling fans to buy satellite dishes. The deal with FMW is only about $150,000 for 10 shows, however they did pay for production, special effects, etc. on the April 30th show, so it gave the FMW house show far more of a major league look to the event, which is important in the long run even in Japan. Sky Perfect TV, which does Pancrase and will also be doing live monthly WCW PPVs. Spring Stampede from Denver was the first American pay-per-view to go into Japan live, is now in 600,000 homes, but it is a number that is growing rapidly, so at this point with a 5.0 buy rate, there would be some money to be made. The Gracie/Takada match last year did an 8.0 buy rate, but far fewer homes were available at the time, so it still wasn't any kind of a big money deal.
There is a big indie show on May 21st at Korakuen Hall, which Victor Quiñones must have some involvement with, as the WWF is sending Terry Funk and Kaientai DX. Funk debuts his Chainsaw Charlie gimmick in Japan against Tarzan Goto, and Kadenai faces Gecko, Masao Orihara, and Paramio NZP. Lioness Asuka regained the TWF Women's title from Kyoko Inoue on the May 6 Neo Ladies show at Korakuen Hall. Inoue had won the title on April 26 on a JD show. Asuka came to the rival group show with her Saikyo Gun, a heel group which includes Eagle Sawai and Shark Tsuchiya, and the women at ringside interfered using chains, chairs, tables, and 2x4s. After the match, Asuka grabbed the house mic on Inoue's show and said that this is 21st century pro wrestling and Inoue needs to get with the changes. Urgent is working a really rough style and the wrestlers are getting banged up to where so many are injured that they're dropping like flies. AJW debuted a rookie, Tomoka Isazaki, who is doing a protege of the Zap's masked gimmick. Isazaki debuted on May 5th, and what's interesting about her is that she's blind in her left eye. She's always wanted to be a pro wrestler, but when she was young, her parents wouldn't allow it, but while in college she competed internationally in karate tournaments. Emi Motokawa has some sort of a major illness that put her in the hospital for 10 days and she won't be back until late June. Hiromi Yagi, 26, a former JWP wrestler who retired in March 1997 to get married, will be making a comeback with JD. Kumiko Makawa won the All-Pacific title from AJW, beating Zap T, Tomoko Watanabe, on May 5th at Korakuen Hall. At that show, Manami Toyota issued a challenge to Shinobu Kondori's WWA title for later this year. The wrestlers in Michinoku doing the Sasuke the Great and Masked Tiger gimmicks are Masao Orihara and Takeshi Ono respectively. The new manager in Michinoku Pro is Alan Reed, 29, from Utica, New York, who has been working for years as a dancer at Tokyo Disneyland. How's this for an interesting name for a show? The April 26th War show at Tokyo Korakuen Hall was billed as War is Raw. Saw some photos of the sickness that was billed as the Big Japan Pro Wrestling show on May 1st in Toda. The main event included a bed of nails, which Shadow Winger got powerbombed onto and Mitsuhiro Matsunaga also took a bump onto, a zillion thumbtacks, a scorpion, a barbed wire baseball bat, a cactus tree in a corner and a scaffold with a trampoline made of barbed wire under the scaffold which Shadow WX took up onto, and Matsunaga did a flip plunge off the scaffold onto WX as he was caught in the barbed wire net. After the match in the dressing room, Matsunaga attacked one of the officials with a baseball bat with nails. Here and there. The biggest match in the history of USWF takes place on August 22nd at the Amarillo Fairgrounds, as Steve Nelson faces Ralph Gracie, billed as a $20,000 winner-take-all challenge. Nelson and Gracie met on an EFC pay-per-view event in 1996 in which Gracie won in less than 1 minute. It was a doubly bad weekend for Nelson, as wound up in jail later that night when the Canadian police arrested several of the fighters for participating in the show. Since that time, Nelson started promoting USWF events under rules similar to Pancrase, drawing huge crowds at Amarillo with himself, a middleweight champion, and has always in his publicity talked about his loss to Gracie and pushed from the start of the promotion toward building the rematch. The next USWF date is June 30th in Amarillo, with Evan Tanner defending his heavyweight title against Tony Castillo and Billy Scott versus Paul Jones. Apparently the reason Sid Vicious no-showed his booking last week in New York and a few more this weekend in New Jersey for Dennis Coralluzzo is his claiming that he re-injured his back, either in another auto accident or another lifting injury. Vicious did call Coralluzzo several days ahead of time to tell him due to his injury he couldn't make his dates. Coralluzzo's weekend shows were to be headlined by Vicious and Ahmed Johnson. The story with Johnson, who also no-showed the dates, is strange even by wrestling standards. Johnson demanded his money up front, claiming he'd heard Coralluzzo had a bad rep, and it wound up with Coralluzzo paying Johnson $1,000 of his $1,500 fee for the 2 matches up front. When Coralluzzo's ref Fred Rubenstein went to pick Johnson up at the hotel for the May 8th show in Blackwood, New Jersey, he apparently refused to ride to the show in Rubenstein's Nissan Altima. Johnson supposedly told the guy who was to pick him up that he refused to ride in that car but would get his own car to go to the show, which he never appeared at. At the show, Coralluzzo told fans that Johnson was in town and at the hotel and refused to ride to the show in a Nissan Altima, and then over the PA gave the phone number and room number he was staying and told fans to call the room and give him hell about no showing the card. So Johnson received calls at his room from irate fans all night. The next day, Rubenstein called Johnson's room, where he complained about getting calls all night long, but said to meet him at 3 p.m. to go to the show that night in Keyport, New Jersey. Johnson no-showed that meeting, that show, and also another show he was booked on later that night for Gene Pettit, Cousin Luke. Coralluzzo called up Luna Vachon,
whose husband was booked on the show, and she got Jim Ross approval to appear as an unadvertised manager, also contacted the Headbangers, Pitbulls, and Rocco Rock, who were booked on another show that night 2 hours away and drove in after doing the first show, and they all worked the main event unadvertised. Johnson ended up leaving a message on Cora Luzzo's phone saying something about the IRS and attorneys. Phil Mushnick in the May 4th New York Post on the A&E special, last week's highly promoted A&E expose on pro wrestling was as perverted as pro wrestling, and it hurt to find that Steve Allen agreed to attach his name and narration to such a bucket of garbage. While A&E billed the documentary as one that would reveal the whole truth behind the industry, the 2-hour show primarily served as a tribute to the WWF and WCW. Two of pro wrestling's modern and indisputable constant steroid abuse and the sudden death of active under 40 performers weren't even mentioned. Speaking of that documentary, Steve Yohei sent me a list of results of matches in Los Angeles at the Olympic Auditorium and the old Wrigley Field from the height of the Depression, 1930 to 1932, and as mentioned in last week's issue, the idea that pro wrestling attendance dwindled during the Depression would be as accurate as saying that WWF fortunes plummeted when they made Steve Austin champion. While not every card at the 10,400-seat Olympics sold out by any means, sellouts occurred several times per year for generally biweekly cards that usually consisted of usually 3 and occasionally 4 singles matches. Tag teams had yet to be invented, and major matches such as Gus Sonnenberg vs. Everett Marshall in 1930, Ed Don George vs. Strangler Lewis in 1931, and Jim Londos vs. Ray Steele in 1932 had to be moved outdoors to the old Wrigley Field. There was also a newspaper clipping of a June 1932 match outdoors in New York on Long Island at the old Madison Square Garden Bowl headlined by Lewis beating Dick Chicot, which drew a crowd estimated by the AP as 35,000 fans, which would have been a record for New York State that lasted 48 years and would still be today the second biggest crowd ever for pro wrestling in New York, trailing the Bruno vs. Zbyszko at Shea Stadium, which drew 36,295. The Lou Albano segment aired on May 5th on Fox's Lie Detector TV show hosted by Marcia Clark. The segment was pitiful, more for the writing and performance of Clark than anything Albano did. Clark tried to sell that whether pro wrestling matches are fixed, which is a ridiculous choice of words to begin with, was a question people have been wanting to know the answer to since the beginning of time, trying to sell it on the same level as whether Mark Furman planted the glove. The lie detector said he didn't, and whether Tonya Harding knew about and participated in the plan to take out Nancy Kerrigan. According to her ex-husband's lie detector results, she did. So poor Albano was made to look like the village fraud, showing clips of his early 80s antics with Jimmy Snuka and giving one the impression that he were current, and he said that he had never been involved in a fixed pro wrestling match, and the lie detector machine said he was lying. When the results came in and Clark proudly told the curious public that this answered the age-old question and proved that pro wrestling is in fact fixed, Albano cut a pro wrestling promo on her. Speaking of real and fake, a Japanese reporter friend who saw the A&E special was explaining to me that there is no way such a show could have ever aired in Japan because of where Steve Allen said something to the effect of course pro wrestling is fake, because we wouldn't have it any other way. In Japan, for anyone to say pro wrestling is fake, that the general public reaction to such a statement would be you are so simple-minded, as anyone who were to simplify pro wrestling into a real fake issue being of any paramount importance is to completely miss what the subject is to begin with. Like doing a big documentary to address whether movies are actually real life. Billy Black and Chris Walker are headed to Music City. The MCW TV show starts airing on WATL, Channel 36, in Atlanta at 2:30 a.m. on Saturdays in mid-June and will also be getting clearance in September on WATL TV, Channel 38, in Detroit. The May 9th show was headlined by a loser of the fall leaving town for 30 days with Nick Dinsmore and Rob Conway beating Stephen Dunn and Reno Riggins when Riggins lost the fall. Rex King is coming as Dunn's new tag team partner on May 16th against Conway and Doug Gilbert. Wolfie D, who has been out with an injury, returns May 16th against Colorado Kid. NWA Georgia Championship Wrestling run by Don Lewis is presenting its first show on June 24th in Marietta, Georgia at Cobb County Civic Center with Tommy Rich vs. Barry Windham, Rock and Roll Express vs. Stephen Dunn and Reno Riggins, Doug Gilbert vs. Brickhouse Brown, and a 6-man tournament to crown a Georgia champion with Flash Flanagan, Rex King, Franchi Riviera, Bulldog Reigns, Billy Black and Chris Walker plus Abdullah the Butcher will wrestle on the undercard, and also billed to be making appearances at the show are Dan Severn, Arlena, Bob Armstrong, and Dutch Mantle. There are a series of church-sponsored pro wrestling events which will include testimonies by former wrestlers such as superstar Billy Graham, Ted DiBiase, and Nikita Koloff. The dates are May 22nd in Wheeling, West Virginia,
June 12th in Beaumont, Texas, and July 17th in El Paso. Among those wrestling at the various events, in which admission will be $5, will be George South, the Rock and Roll Express, and Eddie and Hector Guerrero. In Beaumont, Cactus Jack and Goldust will wrestle. USA Pro Wrestling is doing a convention at the Forest Hills, New York Jewish Center from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. on June 14th with Sonny, Valiant Brothers, Bushwhackers, Iron Sheik, Honky Tonk Man, Tito Santana, Jimmy Snuka, Demolition Axe, Pitbulls, King Kong Bundy, and Coco Ware. For more info, call 800-582-5541, and if you bring an observer, you get $2 off admission. Century Wrestling Alliance has changed its name to NWA New England Championship Wrestling and has changed its title belts to reflect the changes. So the NWA New England TV champ is Vic Steamboat, the heavyweight champ is Eric Spraxia, and the cruiserweight champion is Trey. Missy Hyatt's name popped up in indie results for a woman versus man angle on May 9th in Port Jervis, New York. A group called International All-Star Wrestling ran a show before 200 fans in Sarasota, Florida, billing it as WCW versus WWF. The only current wrestlers from either group on the show were Skull and Jose Estrada Jr., who wrestled each other. Among others on the show included Malia Hasaka, Sherry Martel, Brian Knobs, Typhoon, Greg Valentine, Craig Pittman, the Bushwhackers, and the Head Shrinkers. Terry Gordy and Michael Hayes, Doak Hendricks, reunited as the Fabulous Freebirds for Bad Boys of Wrestling on May 9th in Missoula, Montana. Also on the boat tour of Montana besides Texas regulars and midgets were Greg Valentine, Jake Roberts, and One Man Gang. Severn worked on May 8th for NWA Southwest in North Richland Hills, Texas, beating Rod Price due to outside interference after a ref bump by Brian Adias. They raised ticket prices for the show and drew 300 fans, so it was the second best house in the history of the new company, trailing only the show where they brought in Mil Mascaras to headline. The former Miss Texas returned to Memphis, now being called Jackie, to feud with Samantha. She got almost no pop when she showed up at shows this past week, as apparently Stacey Carter, Jerry Lawler's girlfriend, is the hot woman in the company. They did an angle on TV where Samantha, who was trying to get a job, was offered by Tony Falk to be his valet, but she gave him a stone-cold stunner, and then gave Downtown Bruno, in the role as senior referee, a stunner before Jackie made the save. Kid Wicked, the former Tony Williams, won a battle royal on the May 9th TV show from Memphis to become the first Young Guns champion. Jimmy Valiant, 57, was at the May 2nd TV show and got a big pop, but they did an angle before his scheduled match which enabled him not to wrestle, or whatever it is they call what he does. As those who have seen him on recent indie shows in the Carolinas attest to, there are not only corpses that look more alive than Valiant, but some which have better work rates. Sir Mo showed up at the May 9th taping, going under the new ring name of BJ Awesome, to start a feud with Brian Christopher as he interfered in a wild stretcher match with Christopher and Spellbinder versus Billy Travis and Paul Diamond. Christopher hit Awesome over the head with a board as the show ended. The May 24th Draka show from the Forum in Los Angeles will be available live on USSB Direct Satellite on pay-per-view with Maurice Smith versus Sean Claude as the headliner. The only other thing I know about the show is that Frank Shamrock will be doing the announcing. I guess it's a limited pay-per-view to test the waters before doing a full-blown pay-per-view, although that makes no sense since you have to spend the money for production and satellite either way, and they're spending the money and almost nobody is carrying the thing. Championship Pro Wrestling on June 20th in Moorfield, West Virginia and June 21st in Martinsburg, West Virginia has Honky Tonk Man headlining, and you can get $1 off any ticket by mentioning the Wrestling Observer at the door. NHB. One final change in the May 15th UFC pay-per-view lineup. Francisco Bueno of Brazil, who was scheduled to face Mike Van Arsdale, pulled out due to a problem coughing up blood. He'll be replaced by Joe Pardo, 31, who trained for 5 years under Hoist Gracie, and is 1-0 in NHB with a win over Brad Kohler earlier this year, although he did lose to Tim Catalfo in a submissions-only tournament in Griffin, Georgia. Dan Henderson is confirmed as being in the middleweight tournament, although he's been banged up lately in wrestling matches. Carlos Newton, who is in the same tournament, last week captured the Canadian Open Jiu-Jitsu Championships both in his weight class and in the Open division for the second straight year, beating stablemate Joel Gerson in the finals. Gerson was the fighter who handed Ruben Asado his first career loss in the huge upset a few months back, although that's something of a size mismatch since Newton is about 180 and Gerson is closer to 150. The Frank Shamrock versus Jeremy Horn match will actually take place before the pay-per-view starts rather than after it finishes, and the idea is that provided everything goes without a hitch, he wins and doesn't get hurt,
Shamrock would do color commentary during the pay-per-view show. The working idea for now for UFC will be to do the next live pay-per-view show on October 17th, which would possibly be the show from Brazil, and another one in December. Theoretically, those shows would probably be headlined by the Shamrock Horn winner defending against the winner of the May 15th tournament and Coleman, provided he gets by Williams, challenging Randy Couture for the heavyweight title. For whatever this is worth, and as history has shown, UFC long-term plans never go as planned, usually due to injuries, upsets and money problems. Helen Goes is being groomed for the title match with Shamrock, which would be a rematch of their classic 1995 Pancrase match, which went to a draw but in which Shamrock broke Goes' ankle with an ankle lock which Goes didn't tap out to, eventually actually escaped from, and fought several minutes with a broken ankle before the time limit expired. The UFC show will test closed circuit out with a live airing at Sports Plus in Lake Grove, New York. Dan Severn will have another shoot match on May 15th in Conesville, Iowa against Kevin Rosier, the 300-pound former kickboxer. They met just recently with Severn winning in under 30 seconds. With 20 verifiable NHB victories, Severn has more wins in NHB competition than anyone but Russian Igor Vachenchin, who has 22 wins, and lightweight Pat Miletic, who also has 20 wins. Reports on his last victory on April 25th in Guam before a near sellout 3,500 were that Severn broke foe John Calvo's nose with a strong right, delivered 4 or 5 knees to the head while standing before the takedown, and won with punches from the mount which led to a tap at 338. Calvo, 260 pounds with a wrestling background, had won the heavyweight tournament on the last show in Guam. It is interesting that the NBC affiliate in Guam, aired the show on free television, which would be a first for a major network affiliate. The Mexican Galavision network has aired tapes of previous UFC shows on free TV in the United States, although that is pretty much a well-kept secret. There are actually promoters trying to put together a match with Miletic, who won the recent UFC under 170-pound tournament and has a 21-1 record, to face Severn in Iowa. Miletic would probably, without having to cut weight, come in close to 190 and be giving away a good 60 pounds. Promoters are trying to put it together for August since Severn has such an incredibly busy, to the point of insane schedule. Ken Shamrock will be at the UFC show in Pete Williams' corner for his match against Mark Coleman. Shamrock will probably do an interview on the show. He did an interview for UFC this past week in which he talked about his career in WWF, saying that pro wrestling was scripted but that he actually takes more of a physical beating in pro wrestling than he did in UFC. However, he weaved in his own modernized version of a pro wrestling storyline by claiming that his current injury was when his tag team partner, never mentioning the name Owen Hart, went against the script and attacked and injured him. Since his injury, Shamrock has been in Dallas with Guy Mesger, Trey Teligman and Jerry Bullender getting Williams ready for the Coleman match. KRS announced that its next show on June 24th at Budokan Hall would have Nobuhiko Takada versus Kyle Stujan, who is billed as a 31-year-old 225-pound protege of Joe Moreira. Word ahead of time was that KRS was looking for someone to do a job for Takada, since Takada has to be protected and given credibility as a shooter for his October rematch with Rickson Gracie at the Tokyo Dome. Emmanuel Yarbrough, who apparently was 660 pounds, and from photos he looked like he weighed a ton more than Mabel, but I don't think even he can touch Yokozuna at his heaviest, making him the largest man ever to compete in NHB, when he had his recent win over Tatsuo Nakano, is going to fight on the show. Representative Robin Williams, boy, I'll bet he has problems with anyone taking him seriously, of Augusta, Georgia, introduced a bill which basically would allow NHB events to take place in Georgia and remove any question of the Georgia Boxing Commission having any sanctioning rights over it. The bill passed 161-2 in the House, 47-1 in the Senate, and was signed by Governor Zell Miller, who longtime wrestling fans may remember as someone who in a different stage of his political career in the early 80s used to campaign on Georgia Championship Wrestling, goes into law on July 1st. In late 1996, UFC presented a show in Augusta and the commission tried to stop it, and they ended up going to court at the last minute with UFC winning that case. ECW. An update on the New Jack Junkyard Dog deal from the pay-per-view show. Apparently there was an argument between the two when New Jack started yelling at Jid over some money owed him going back many years in the past. New Jack started bad-mouthing him, Jid didn't back down at all, and punches were exchanged, with New Jack getting more in before it was quickly broken up. That was why Jid had the bandage on him when he went out for his Legends presentation. Whether this quick expenditure of energy had anything to do with Jack later collapsing in his match with Bam Bam Bigelow is open to question, although it's pretty clear that the other excuses given, that he ran into a stiff punch and was knocked out, or was knocked out by a chair shot, have been dismissed as a convenient cover story. The spot where he went out was apparently just before Bigelow started throwing chairs on him, which was just a way to kill time before he recovered his bearings. Shane Douglas was telling people that when he watched a tape of his match, he couldn't even remember most of what had taken place. Douglas is scheduled for elbow surgery on June 1st. He did appear at the ECW show in Buffalo, New York and did an interview, and even though nobody touched him, by the end of his interview his nose was bleeding. He was said to have looked a lot better backstage than he had the previous 2 weeks. The situation with Al Snow is that he's always been under contract to Titan, and it was known by all concerned that once he got over, if he got over that is, that he'd take the gimmick and go to Titan with it. Paul Heyman made a deal with WWF to get Snow, Phil LaFon and Doug Furnas, and said he'd come up with gimmicks to get them over and they could return to WWF with the new gimmicks, and later something similar was tried with Too Cold Scorpio. In exchange, besides getting workers with experience to theoretically add to ECW depth, Titan provided the airfare for the talent to work the ECW shows and also paid their salary. So Heyman was basically getting them free of charge, and his end of the deal was to create characters for them to return with and be more marketable. It worked with Snow and didn't with Furnas and LaFon. And at this point Furnas is basically an ECW wrestler, and LaFon may or may not wind up being one when he recovers from shoulder surgery. The deal with Brackus, who it appears Titan has totally given up on ever making it by the virtue of having him job every night on the recent Germany tour and the fact you never hear his name, and Darren Drostoff, who it is expected that Titan is going to soon make the third member of LOD 2000, was different, although Titan also loaned both of them to ECW, as they were just supposed to be given time to get into small programs and get some ring time and not have new gimmicks created for them, since they weren't ready for the big time because of inexperience. ECW has about 6 weeks to finish Snow up as a full-timer at the house show. Roadkill was fired over some sort of a problem in the dojo. The May 16th ECW Arena show will be headlined by the old Mexican Parejas Increíbles style match with Sabu and Chris Candido versus Lance Storm and Rob Van Dam, and a Stairway to Hell match, a ladder with barbed wire hanging from the ceiling, and first team to get it can use it, with Dudleys versus Spike Dudley and Tommy Dreamer and Sandman. May 9th in Buffalo, New York saw ECW draw its best crowd to date for a non-pay-per-view event with 3,241 paid. The figure is even more amazing since WCW put tickets on sale for the Ilio Di Paolo show, which doubles as a Thunder on June 11th, the day before, and sold 8,763 tickets the first day through the ticket outlets, and Dennis Di Paolo sold perhaps 2,000 more. Said to be a decent show but couldn't touch the previous show in the building, which had the Van Dam versus Bigelow match. Among the angles saw Danny during face Chris Chetty, but Taz did a run-in and destroyed both of them. Afterwards Sabu came out to challenge Chetty, who really didn't sell the previous beating much, and Sabu beat him. FBI versus Supernova and Blue Meanie turned into FBI, losing to Axel Rotten and Balls Mahoney. They did an angle where Douglas, Bigelow and Candido came out and invited Lance Storm, based on his performance at the pay-per-view, to join the triple threat. Storm was getting ready to face Jamie Dundee, who pretty much showed up out of nowhere. Storm said he'd only join and Candido was thrown out. It wound up with Candido and Bigelow attacking Storm and eventually a Bigelow versus Storm singles match that Bigelow won. Justin Credible had a match with Jerry Lynn. Apparently Credible got his bell rung and was basically knocked out for 2 minutes, and instead of stopping the match, they waited for him to recover to do the rest of the match. Van Dam got a huge reaction from the match the previous month, and beat Doug Furnas in a good bout. Main event was Dudley's beat Dreamer and Sandman and Spike, and after the match New Jack did the big run-in with the weapons. May 8th in Rochester, New York drew 817 with Sabu over Snow on top. Curtis Hughes was backstage at the ECW pay-per-view show. It was said that he's lost a lot of weight, which is good in his case. WCW. Ric Flair has become the cause célèbre on the internet. In the People magazine voting for the 50 most beautiful people in the world, wrestling websites managed to rally around Flair to the tune of 17,145 votes, picking up huge between the time we went to press and the balloting that ended over the weekend, making him second to only the Howard Stern fans voting for Hank the Drunken Dwarf, who got 230,169 votes. Poor Leonardo DiCaprio and his $20 million per picture paycheck and cover photo in the current issue on the stands, as being the heartthrob of this year, could only manage 14,471. Maybe Leonardo should try and get Bischoff to sue him and get Hogan to try and bury him so he can take second next year.
In its first press release, people wrote that Hank had beaten out Leonardo, causing outrage among the wrestling fans, so a later press release in fact listed Flair as number 2, mentioning him as a 25-year veteran, a 13-time world champion, and mentioning he was currently involved in a lawsuit over missing a Nitro and a Thunder taping. The next W on Flair's parade appears to be Time Magazine's net voting for the Man of the Century, which opened this week. Flair, among every man who lived during this century and even Jesus Christ, who didn't live in this century but people who can't get their time frames straight still got him in 11th place, was currently in first place and had received 25% of the total votes in balloting that will continue until the end of 1999. This time will allow fans of such minor historical figures such as Mahatma Gandhi, who somehow in the poll I received was listed in both 6th and 12th place as if he was two different people, Albert Einstein, Adolf Hitler, Winston Churchill, Pope John Paul II, and another pro wrestler, superstar Billy Graham. Oh, you think it's a different Billy Graham getting all those votes? Man, are you clueless? Billy Graham created the gimmick that Hulk Hogan copied, and everyone knows Hulkamania to this day is the most powerful force in the universe, and if you don't believe it, check the TV ratings for Monday, okay, a few Mondays ago, to play catch-up. From what we've been told, with nothing to do but stay home and train, Flair is said to have gotten himself in phenomenal condition. Marcus Bagwell was released from the hospital on May 8 after his latest round of complications stemming from internal bleeding. Lineup for the Slamboree pay-per-view on May 17 in Worcester, Massachusetts. Besides Randy Savage vs. Bret Hart with Roddy Piper as ref, Giant and Sting vs. Scott Hall and Kevin Nash for the tag titles. There was talk of Hall turning on Nash in this match originally, but with the idea of Giant going heel, that may have been changed. Raven vs. Page in a Bowery Street fight in a cage. Bill Goldberg vs. Kurt Hennig for the U.S. title, or perhaps Perry Saturn if Hennig knee isn't ready by Sunday, as I believe he was just scoped a few days ago. Luger vs. Adams, Jericho vs. Dean Malenko for the Cruiserweight title. Although on TV it was announced they'd be having a battle royal where the winner gets a shot later in the show, a Cruiserweight battle royal. David Finlay vs. Chris Benoit for the TV title and Ron Race vs. Juventud Guerrera. At press time there were about 300 tickets remaining. There was a lot of talk in the days preceding Nitro that in order to win the ratings, this would be the week to bring in Jim Hellwig, with Hogan being the one making the suggestion. It ended up being overruled with the feeling that they should wait until after the NBA playoffs when they have every week back in the regular slot before making that play, but that does pretty much end speculation as to if Hellwig is coming in and simply changes it to which week. Nitro drew 15,941, which is 15,392, paying $270,814 to Kemper Arena in Kansas City. It opened with Bret Hart doing an interview. Hart got some major heel heat. Disco Inferno beat Barry Horowitz in 137 with a neckbreaker. Randy Savage did an interview challenging Hogan to a match later in the show. Kidman beat Guerrera in 351 with a shooting star press after Ron Race flattened Juvie Juice with a neck-hanging tree slam. A great TV match as Juvie is just awesome, and is getting over for no logical reason, which means that he's in line to get buried even more. Bischoff did his interview. Scott Norton pinned Yuji Nagata with a shoulder breaker in 146. For some reason it appeared Sonny Wanu was rooting for both men. Hugh Morris pinned Jim Powers with a moonsault in 26. Nash and Conan did an interview. Nash appeared to be getting things off his chest, as he is known for doing on interviews. But it seemed nobody in the crowd knew what the hell he was talking about, as his stuff wasn't getting pops. He also used the first Viagra line of the night to get no crowd reaction. Jerry Lawler also had one later, but the crowd live didn't hear it. And at the end of the show, Piper delivered a Viagra line that also got no pop. Ultimo Dragon beat Johnny Swinger in 203 with the Dragon Sleeper. Swinger isn't nearly ready for prime time because Dragon had trouble doing almost every move. Chavo Jr. came out and shook Dragon's hand. Eddie then argued with Chavo, who shoved Eddie down, but Eddie slapped Chavo and Dragon put the Dragon Sleeper on Eddie. Chavo then saved Eddie. Eddie then attacked Dragon, but Chavo saved Dragon. Dusty Rhodes returned to do a promo for the non-existent Scott Hall, saying over and over again that Hall had personal problems. Zbyszko legitimately hates Dusty because he still has a grudge against how Dusty booked him in the 80s in the Carolinas since, after all, both Larry Z and Flair were wrestlers of about the same level and one was always on top and the other in the middle, and also because after doing the angle for the Dusty turn, Dusty then pulled out and gave Larry Z no comeback. Anyway, the only comeback Larry Z gets is to say things like Dusty is so big he could be in both NWOs at the same time. The announcers brought up that Dusty won his first world title in Kansas City. Actually, it was Tampa. It was Ric Flair and Harley Race who both won their first world titles in Kansas City. Goldberg beat Len Denton in 52.
J.J. Dillon and Raven did an interview where they mocked Shawn Michaels.
Raven said since he keeps getting attacked by fans that WCW has provided him an unsafe working environment. That was the same thing Michaels' lawyer and later Davey Boy Smith's lawyer complained to the WWF as a shoot. Michaels after the backstage fight with Bret Hart and Smith after the screw job on Bret Hart. So Raven now has 4 SWAT team guys around him.
How long before one of them takes off their SWAT gear and it's Page?
Raven then invited Saturn out and the entire flock jumped Hammer, and Saturn laid him out with the Death Valley driver.
Saturn beat Jerry Flynn in 52 with the DVD. Finlay beat Rage of High Voltage in 321 with a Tombstone piledriver in the TV title bout. Chaos kept interfering until Booker T came out and began brawling with him, and then Benoit came out and brawled with T. J.J. Dillon then came out and said that Benoit and T's matches on the show were being cancelled and they'll have a singles match against each other later in the show with the winner meeting Finlay at the pay-per-view. This is where the difference between WWF and WCW rang out loud and clear. On the entire TV show, the only thing the announce plugged was a match with Benoit versus T where the winner would get the title shot. Then they do this big angle to announce something and pretend the card was being changed. Page beat Lenny Lane with a diamond cutter in 255. Page challenged Raven to come out, but Raven walked out. Poor Bobby Heenan then said Page was so mad at Raven he's going to chase him backstage, but instead Page just stood in the ring and jumped in the crowd, so Heenan, not at all his fault because he didn't know better, made Page out to be an idiot. Hogan and Bischoff did an interview. Hogan said Nash and Hall were guys who didn't have enough talent to get to the top on their own and they were looking for the rub from Hogan. Hogan accepted the Savage challenge. He then invited Nash to come out, and had Giant dressed in an NWO t-shirt come out and attack Nash, and they spray-painted NWO on Nash's back. Jericho did an interview and Joe Malenko came out. Malenko had no fire and basically killed this segment. Jericho ended up attacking him, breaking some things over his head. Glacier beat Sick Boy in 205 with the cryonic kick. After the match, Saturn used the same move on Glacier to start a feud between the two of them. Luger did an interview saying that Rick Steiner underwent 3 hours of surgery and would be out for 3 to 4 months and challenged Adams for the pay-per-view. Benoit beat T with the crossface in 642. A good match. But Benoit seemed to be having problems with his knees. Finale saw Savage beat Hogan via DQ. The MTV special on May 9th from Chelsea Pier in Manhattan was so bad that all standards of bad for this industry have now become passé. The real problem is it was pouring rain and windy as hell and the event was held outdoors. There were about 40 to 50 fans watching. Announcers Tony Schiavone and Zbyszko acted as if they didn't want to be there. There were supposed to be 8 matches in a 3-hour special, but due to the rain they only had 1 match, a 90 seconds bout where Public Enemy beat High Voltage, and the rest were bad interviews, bad angles and bad weather. The show ended up being cut to 2 hours, and it was so bad that the scheduled replay showing of it later that evening was cancelled. The show offered the audience to call a 900 line to vote for bands with the winners advancing in a tournament and the final winner would become the MTV champion. And faster than you can say consumer 900 line fraud, it was over with Page and Raven, who the entire show was set up as a personal vehicle for the two, which had everything gone right would have been a clever idea in the finals. They did an angle where Raven tried to jump him after losing the phone vote, making Page the champ, and Page laying both he and Sick Boy out using the bull rope. Page also got to lay out Brad Armstrong earlier in the show with the diamond cutter. Nash and Benoit were both supposed to be there, but Nash said that he wasn't about to miss Mother's Day and Benoit said he needed to go to Calgary. There may be some problems stemming from this event due to it being put together without commission authorization and some participants allegedly hadn't been licensed. Rey Mysterio Jr., who showed up having added about 15 pounds of new muscle, signed a 1-year contract on May 4th. Scott Steiner is out with a herniated disc in his back. Lismark Jr. should be returning soon from an ankle injury. Several people are submitting their own booking ideas to where they can be the ones to beat Goldberg first. Reports on Goldberg's contract vary depending upon the source, but the more reliable reports seem to be something in the range of 4 years at $2.4 million, which would be $400,000 this year, 2 years at $600,000, and the final year at $800,000. Ref Mark Curtis, Brian Hildebrand, was married this past week to his longtime girlfriend. It has been quite a trying year for Hildebrand with a major fight with cancer, and it's great to see him making such a strong comeback every week on television. Hall was at the May 4th Nitro, but the decision was made not to use him on camera until the pay-per-view, trying to tease an angle as if nobody is sure he'll be at the pay-per-view because Hogan and Bischoff may keep him of the show. Let's see, it's a weak card to begin with. No Hogan. Bad time slots due to preemptions and time changes. And ahead of time you're telling us that you don't know if one of the main eventers is going to show.
Who comes up with this?
Hogan. Okay, now it makes perfect sense. WCW Saturday Night was taped May 5th in Springfield, Illinois before a sellout 4,957 paying $90,052. Not much to the show. Guerrera beat Jericho via DQ, but on the second show Horace Boulder beat Guerrera.
The only marquee match on either show, if you can even call it that, saw Giant beat Norton via DQ, which may not be able to air since after the time the match was taped they came up with the idea that Giant and Norton are on the same team.
For whatever reason, the actual plan was for Norton to beat Giant with outside interference, but Giant wouldn't do it, so the DQ was the compromise.
Ultimo Dragon has maintained its name because WCW is now thinking about fighting the Ricky Steamboat lawsuit rather than caving right away.
At the house shows this week there were a lot of problems. At all stops, the Steiners missed the shows with the announcement of Rick's torn rotator cuff and surgery, and claiming Scott was suspended for the attack, which makes perfect sense since it was Adams, and not Scott, who attacked Rick. However, on May 7th and May 8th in Omaha and Salina, Kansas, both of which sold out, the first day tickets were put on sale. They also announced Goldberg wouldn't be there because of a family emergency. Actually, on May 8th they pulled Goldberg from the house shows to do an on-sale open in Philadelphia. There's something about advertising a guy for house shows and then pulling him from those shows so he can promote other house shows that leaves a bad taste even by the standards of this industry.
They did post signs about the no-shows at the doors, but also stated that there would be no refunds or ticket exchanges.
The reaction in Salina, Kansas for Goldberg not being there was said to have been horrible.
Refunds again weren't offered, but fans were loudly chanting refund through the first several matches, and it was a very angry crowd all night.
Originally they were going to send Hall home early for the dreaded personal problems, but after the horrible reaction in Salina and with a huge crowd in Wichita, he was kept on the road until May 9th and then went home to tend to, among other things, a child custody hearing. Hall put Sting over via pinfall the first two nights of the tour on top, while in Salina it was Sting and Luger beating Hall and Norton, and I believe Topeka's headliner was Sting and Luger over Norton and Adams.
Gates for the house shows were May 6th in Des Moines drew 6,263 paying $126,344. May 7th in Omaha drew a sellout 6,064 paying $118,742.
May 8th in Salina, Kansas drew a sellout 4,881 paying $92,586. May 9th in Wichita drew 9,262 paying $175,692, and May 10th in Topeka drew 6,258 and $133,589. Merchandise for the week was $504,833 or $9.51 per head. WCW and Mark Madden have reconciliation meetings set for this week. First day ticket sales for June 18th Thunder in Philadelphia was $8,053 paying $151,486. Kevin Green was backstage in Kansas City with them talking to him about the Four Horsemen gimmick. Besides Hellwig, the other big ratings hotshot is to settle with Flair. July 10th in Los Angeles at the Forum will be Hogan vs. Savage for the title in a cage match. Sting vs. Hart and Goldberg vs. Hennig. WCW Saturday Night was preempted on May 9th due to auto racing, even though a show was actually taped. WWF lineup for Over the Edge pay-per-view on May 31st in Milwaukee is Steve Austin vs. Dude Love with Vince McMahon as referee, Gerald Briscoe as bell ringer and Pat Patterson as ring announcer, Vader vs. Kane in a mask vs. mask match. One would think Kane would win, except I'm told the new Yak doll of Kane doesn't have a mask. Rocky Maivia vs. Farouk for the IC title with the nation banned from ringside. Owen Hart and Kama Mustafa, now known as the Godfather of the Motion with cigar and black fedora, and D'Lo Brown vs. Hunter Hearst Helmsley and New Age Outlaws, Jeff Jarrett vs. Steve Blackman, and LOD 2000 vs. Skull and 8-Ball, plus another match or two still to be added. Raw on May 11th in Baltimore drew 8,069 paying $192,895. There wasn't much to the shotgun show. Scott Taylor beat Papi Chulo when Jerry Lawler hit him with a foreign object, and Midnight Express beat Steve Corino and Julio Sanchez via DQ when Headbangers jumped Midnights to keep their stuff alive. Raw opened with Dude Love, with a new haircut with his hair lightened, beard well groomed, saying that he found his smile, with new teeth, in a suit and tie dressed as a school teacher,
talking about what a great representative he'd be as WWF champion while a glowing McMahon watched.
They introduced Briscoe as the timekeeper and Patterson as the ring announcer, and McMahon left because the ref never came out.
Patterson then introduced the ref as the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be. Well, actually that's what he was supposed to say, but he botched the line, and McMahon came out in an ultra-tight ref shirt.
DX came to the WCW offices. Al Snow showed up at the back door and the crowd responded with ECW chants. Vader destroyed Barry Windham in 206, and the Midnights ran in and took bumps for Vader as well. They plugged Austin's role doing the voiceovers for a Steve Austin cartoon character for MTV Celebrity Deathmatch, and it gave them the chance to knock the WCW MTV deal from 2 days earlier. Skull pinned Hawk in 2:30.
Actually, 8-Ball did the switcheroo and used the lamest inside cradle on record to pin Hawk. They announced they'd be putting tickets on sale for July 25th at the Cow Palace in San Francisco on May 15th, which is significant because WCW has a Thunder on July 23rd in Oakland that they were trying to get the jump on, and also because they announced this date nationally before the May 15th show in San Jose had taken place,
which goes totally against their methods of promotion in the past. DX went to CNN Center. Bradshaw taught Taka Michinoku how to drive and smoke a cigar with all the stereotypical stuff where Taka is coughing because he doesn't know how to smoke and about to crash because he doesn't have a clue how to drive.
The guy is 24 years old and they portray him like he's a semi-retarded child because he's a foreigner.
Anyway, they came back from wherever they went cruising and it was time for the Munchkin attack.
Farouk beat Jarrett via DQ in 155 when Blackman threw an awesome front kick on Jarrett, but it wound up with Mark Henry and Kama interfering for the DQ.
The Nation had another entrance song this week, this revolving around Rock's pet phrases like laying the smackdown. They did a mock commercial for the Briscoe Brothers Body Shop. It was so corny it was great, but I think they've gone about as far with that gag as possible. They showed a series of clips of Val Venus constantly coming. The two things interesting about this were that it was in the first hour. WWF people had constantly told me that Venus stuff would always be kept in the second hour, and that since TSN aired the show live, I'm presuming it was on TSN, which had edited Val Venus, and often Goldust, out of the taped shows. Sable and Mark Marrow did their angle. Marrow picked her up and could have given her the TKO but put her down and told her to apologize for ruining his career.
Thankfully she didn't, because if she had, she would have been 30 seconds premature. She kicked him low and gave him a power bomb and left him laying. Most likely Medusa will be brought into feud with Sable as Marrow's new valet, perhaps doing a kickboxing gimmick. Undertaker showed up and attacked Jerry Lawler. He set up a tombstone but the lights went out and Kane's music played. Kane and Uncle Paul came out and Bearer said next week he'd prove that he was Kane's father. They are going to do the DNA test deal. When the lights went on, Taker then tombstone Lawler.
Al Snow showed up in Lawler's seat complaining about wanting to see Vince, wearing his Job Squad t-shirt from ECW, and they had Briscoe and Patterson ordering him to leave and called security on him but he ran away. DX did an interview but Hart came out and challenged Triple H and brought the Nation with him. They had a match that would be considered average at best, ending when Hart bit Helmsley's ear and Helmsley bladed the ear and everyone ran in for the no contest in 6:28.
Dustin came out and burned his Goldust outfit and blamed McMahon for everything, and did his latest babyface turn. It didn't seem like anyone cared as there was no reaction except one fan screaming loudly and often, "He's still a faggot." Kaientai beat Terry Funk and Too Cold Scorpio via DQ in 3:11. Jim Cornette even brought up that Men's Teo grew up idolizing Terry Funk. One of his first ring names in wrestling was Terry Boy, as a kid doing a total Funk imitation.
All five guys worked really hard and really well, but it's impossible to take this as anything more than a comedy match because of the size difference. Finally, Austin and Vince versus Maivia and Brown went to a no contest in 8:28. Austin's work was awesome. Undertaker pinned Kane in the dark match, which was described as really bad. The site for next year's WrestleMania is far from definite.
Toronto is still a possibility, but the new arena isn't expected to be ready by then, and several other cities are also possibilities.
McMahon is doing basically a dry run for his pay-per-view stint by refereeing the Austin-Helmsley title match on May 23rd at Toronto Sky Dome. There is nothing to rumors of Scorpio joining the Nation.
On May 3rd in Hamilton, ONT Scorpio and Kama formed the Nation tag team, but it was because Henry and Brown, who were both supposed to appear, were detained for a while at the border, and decided since they were detained for so long to no-show the card, and both were significantly fined for that decision. Scorpio was just a makeshift adjustment because of no-shows. Steve Regal was in for more meetings this past week to get ideas down for his new character. Regal has trimmed down to 251, he topped out at 283 in WCW, and they want him at 245 for his introduction. Dustin Rhodes has knee surgery on May 5th and will be out of the ring for 3 or 4 more weeks. The WWF is doing another camp this week, under Dory Funk.
Among those at the camp are Solo Fafatu, Mick Tierney, John Tenta, Paul Silva, Aaron O'Grady, Vic Grimes, Sean Stasiak, Matt Bloom, who is going to be brought in as the huge son of George Steele, Andrew Martin, who I believe is a former Canadian Football League player who has been training under Leo Burke, George Phillips, another one who Burke has been training, Emery Hale, David Heath, Vampire Warrior, Darren Drostoff, and Dan Severn.
WWF has gotten Severn, who they've been wanting to go to camps, to bury the hard feelings and work professionally with Funk. X-Pac is expected back in the ring in June and may have a prominent role in the King of the Ring pay-per-view. Austin appeared on TSN's Off the Record on May 5th.
Austin was the single most requested guest ever for the show, and the show was one of the highest rated in the history of the show. Actually, that would make wrestling shows the 3 highest rated ever, since the previous high was the Bret Hart interview just before Survivor Series, and the second highest would have been a Vince McMahon interview. Michael Landsberg, who hosts the show, is an awesome interviewer in that he works with the guest, but if he knows better, is very clear about not letting them get away with BS. He played the tape of where Bischoff said that Austin would be a mid-card performer in WCW, and that he was a big fish in a small pond. Austin said that he didn't believe Bischoff really felt that way because he doesn't believe Bischoff is that stupid, and said that numbers don't lie. Although a clip of Bischoff saying that didn't air, it was clear Austin had full knowledge of the Bischoff interview because of several things he said related to Bischoff's comments during the show, and said Raw's current ratings don't lie, bringing up the 5.72 weeks ago, and saying it was the highest rating in cable history, not technically true. It was the most watched show in cable history and the highest rated since 1988, and said nobody in either company could touch him in merchandise sales, and based on figures we've heard, right now he's more than doubling the number 2 guy, which would be Goldberg. He said the WWF is the big time and the WCW is a place to stay around and get some work. He brought up Bischoff firing him on the phone, saying he didn't have the guts to do it in person. He said in WCW he was in a tag team with Brian Pillman and they could have been the best tag team in history, but they were shut down as a team for political reasons. He said he played defensive end at North Texas State University and that he was a good player, but not good enough to play pro. Landsberg brought up that a lot of what he does, with the swearing and finger language, wouldn't be allowed in WCW, and Austin said even without it he'd be just as popular in WCW. Somehow the subject of the Survivor Series finish was brought up, since a week can't go by without it, and Austin said that Vince never lied to Bret. At this point Landsberg jumped in and said that he did and that he knew he did, because Vince was on the show and had to admit he did. Austin had some major wind taken out of his sails when the host showed him up, because no doubt nobody's been showing him up anywhere for a while, but grumbled about that as far as he was concerned. It was just Vince firing Bret. Landsberg brought up that the business has become riskier than ever and brought up a lot of wrestlers go into the ring with good physiques but are less accomplished wrestlers and less prepared to wrestle than in the past. Austin did say he felt steps should be taken to make things a little safer. When asked about Bill Goldberg, he said he had no problem with him and he felt imitation in the most sincere form of flattery. Pillman was brought up and Landsberg brought up that Bret Hart had in hindsight felt guilt about what happened, wished he had tried to do something, and wondered if Austin felt any guilt. Austin said that Pillman was the best friend I ever had in wrestling and called him one of the smartest guys I've ever met, and mentioned he had personal problems at home and health problems. But he said he didn't feel any guilt, although the tone of his voice was different than at any other time during the show, perhaps sadness and perhaps something else, saying that Pillman never looked for sympathy and didn't want sympathy, and said he didn't think anyone could have done anything about it, trying to categorize it as a heart attack and as something that just happened. Landsberg finished with the word association game. Landsberg brought up Hogan, and Austin called him very successful, but when asked if Hogan was the greatest wrestler of all time, said he's not even close. Landsberg then asked him who the best wrestler in the history of wrestling was, and he said of those he's been in the ring, Bret Hart would be close, but then said it was Ricky Steamboat. Called Dallas Page a friend and a hard worker, called Shawn Michaels extremely talented, but he started crying at the end, said it was a lot of fun working with Mike Tyson and he'd still fight him, said Ric Flair was at one time great but now it's time to hang it up, and said Vince McMahon was a hell of a promoter and close to a genius. Jim Cornette called up Beef Wellington, Shane Bauer, to come in for someone to manage, but at this point it appears that has been vetoed. Nothing to the rumors of Ted Annis, the nephew of Owen Hart, being signed or coming to training camp. Expect a big babyface push for Terry Funk and more matches against Dude Love because of how great their TV match was. June 5th at Madison Square Garden has Austin and Undertaker vs. Kane and Dude, Ken Shamrock vs. Hart. Not sure about this match, but in some cities they are doing I Quit matches. Maivia vs. Farouk for the IC belt, Helmsley vs. Vader for European title, Outlaws vs. LOD for tag titles, Funk vs. Rhodes, Blackman vs. Jarrett, Mero vs. Scorpio, Bradshaw vs. Brown and Bangers vs. Christopher and Taylor. Pierre of the Quebecers apparently blew out his knee on May 9th in St. Louis against Vader, so Jacques Rougeau was called in to work the May 10th show in South Bend. Speaking of Pillman, Melanie Pillman gave birth on May 5th to daughter Skylar Renee Pillman, who would be the daughter Pillman never learned about before he died. The May 8th show in Cincinnati was a benefit show for the Pillman family. Among the items auctioned off were Sable's bra and panties from the pay-per-view match. At the April 29th Pillman Memorial put on by Leigh Thatcher, Elliot Pollock brought out the magazine WWF did on Pillman and said there were only 5 copies remaining and auctioned them off for like $100. 1 week later, they were selling plenty of copies of the same mag at the WWF house show for $5. Weekend house shows was Cincinnati on May 8th drawing 8,081 paying $151,996. St. Louis on May 9th doing 16,840 paying $265,890 and May 10th in South Bend, Indiana drawing 8,141 paying $141,531. Merchandise for the week was $348,501, which is $8.47 per head. Livewire on May 9th did a 1.7 rating and Superstars on May 10th did a 1.8. Jeff Jarrett was actually lip-syncing on the pay-per-view. They went in the studio and taped him actually singing and put it on a tape which they played at the show. Read the book Inside the Lion's Den by Ken Shamrock and Richard Hanner published by Tuttle Publishing. It's basically Shamrock's life story, which makes for interesting reading. Hanner is a very good writer, and it was very interesting to me only because most of the people described in the book close to Ken are people that I've come in contact with, and a lot, but not all, of the stories were things I have some familiarity with, so it was a unique perspective reading on the subject. I thought the coverage of his UFC career, which along with his upbringing, was the focal point of the book, was pretty much right on the money. His training theories on making a fighter and his instructions on fighting, training and technique are interesting to read if you're interested in that subject, although most people who have read it enjoyed the story of his life as the highlight of the book. The subject of pro wrestling comes up very little. Shamrock did admit to taking steroids as a pro wrestler but not as a UFC fighter. His early days in UWF and being tapped out left and right by Funaki and Suzuki when they had more submission knowledge than him were mentioned. PWFG and All Japan were not mentioned at all. His Vince Torelli days also touched on as a very minor part of his life only because it's where he had the incident with the Nasty Boys and first met Dean Malenko, who brought him to Masami Soranaka who got him into Japan. Pancrase was talked about, but not in a lot of detail either, and things like his and his fighters' breakup with the organization wasn't discussed, while UFC was examined very closely and Hanner and Shamrock really did a great job covering almost all facets of UFC. The readers' pages. A&E. Regarding the A&E show, I think the primary reason I didn't have a negative reaction to the show is that I've learned not to expect much out of these kinds of projects. Pro wrestling history is a minefield that few, if any, could cross unscathed. There are probably less than a dozen people in the entire world who I would expect would have the knowledge to do a credible job of presenting the history of pro wrestling. Even within that group, I'd expect to have significant differences of opinion over what they would choose to present. Beyond this very select group, I always expect histories of pro wrestling to be embarrassingly off target. That's also what I expect from any academic study on the sociological meaning of pro wrestling. Sometimes after reading academic analyses, I'll worry for the briefest moment that maybe Shakespeare's only motivation at the time was putting asses in the seats and everyone reads too much into what he did also. When I've been a source for articles or films, I usually just pray that I'm not quoted anywhere near the most blatant errors, or even worse, they aren't misquoted as coming out of my mouth. I take for granted it will be full of blatant errors despite my efforts. Gary Will. Waterloo, Ontario. I saw the A&E special and thought it was very good for what it did cover, but it did fail in a few areas. First, although you received an acknowledgement in the credits and were obviously consulted for information on the business, there should have been a segment about the Observer and wrestling newsletters. Like it or not, the Observer is an important part of the history of pro wrestling. References could have been made to the fact the newsletters fill the void left by the media that won't cover pro wrestling. You should have been interviewed on camera about the role of the observer in today's wrestling climate. Second, the show should have included among the low points of wrestling, the proliferation of steroids and the Zahorian and Mcmahon trials. Any history of pro wrestling is missing something by ignoring this chapter. Also, there should have been a segment about the National Wrestling Alliance and how most of the territories were members of this governing body. Other notable omissions included any mention of ECW and its style, Japanese wrestling, Mexican wrestling, blood, Bruno Sammartino, Ric Flair, drug deaths, and the promotional wars.
Of course, any 2-hour show is going to omit some aspects of a business as complex and varied as pro wrestling, and we'd be able to find fault in anything.
I didn't notice any glaring inaccuracies in the early history of wrestling since it all seemed to be taken from Lou Thez' book, or from Thez himself. It was great to see that history in video form. The stuff on the WCW power plant was fantastic and showed that not everything about pro wrestling is fake. The same could be said about the very real injuries wrestlers suffer. It blew my mind to hear the surprising honesty about the worked nature of the matches from the mouths of current wrestling stars like Kevin Nash. The show was worth keeping on video. Greg Anderson. Kelso, Washington.
I really enjoyed the A&E special.
I absolutely never in a million years thought I'd hear Gorilla Monsoon say that Hulk Hogan doesn't know a wrist lock from a wristwatch. That definitely shows the producers were looking for truthfulness in their subject and could also explain why Gene Okerlund was nowhere in sight. Pat Crocker. Newport, Rhode Island. Response from Dave Meltzer.
They may have been looking for truthfulness, but for the most part, they really didn't get it.
I thought the A&E documentary was pretty well done, but it was somewhat lacking in two significant areas. Neither you nor Bruno Sammartino were featured nor interviewed.
I think both of you would have added a great deal of insight and credibility to the piece.
Perhaps Sammartino was approached and declined, or they declined to use what he may have offered, given that he may have been negative and this was primarily a positive puff piece.
Do you know if Sammartino was approached?
One of the best things the WWF has done is the features with the current stars about being athletes and the nostalgia vignettes with Fred Blassie, Gorilla Monsoon, and Ernie Ladd talking about the abilities of today's stars. I thought they were especially well done, as I'm a long Thai fan who remembers them from their heyday.
As for WCW, I think getting rid of Flair is a real bonehead move, public relations-wise.
His wrestling career is nearing the end, but he could be very effectively utilized as a manager, occasional wrestler, and goodwill ambassador. McMahon would probably make valuable use of him, and I'd like to see him to go the WWF along with Chris Benoit, Dean Malenko, Eddie Guerrero, and Chris Jericho, and anyone else who can wrestle, unless Hogan wants to go to the WWF. Then those guys should stay where they are and be where they belong, at the top.
Do you see WWF gaining long-term momentum in the ratings as a result of the NBA playoffs?
People are generally creatures of habit, and I've been annoyed trying to find the shows. Casual fans could easily put less effort into finding the shows and be lost as viewers.
The WWF's failure to deliver the Austin Mcmahon match in Philadelphia had some friends of mine who drove almost 3 hours to Philadelphia more than annoyed. It won't be going back, and I don't blame them. Wrestling is a hot commodity right now, but the promoters better wise up or it won't stay hot for long.
Bill Gilger. Shamokin, Pennsylvania. Response from Dave Meltzer. Based on what I've been told, Sammartino was never approached by the people from the A&E piece. I was given a thanks in the closing credit, but my only contribution to them was giving them the idea of contacting Lou Thez and Vern Gagne, who they had never heard of, as they were looking for older wrestlers that were famous that would have some knowledge of history and would be willing to go on camera. I was never consulted about anything regarding history of wrestling, but did warn them about making sure to confirm any history stated by wrestlers, since many on camera would try to be self-serving and create their own history. I got the impression in the conversation that accuracy wasn't a major concern.
There may be a few weeks of short-term gains for Raw due to the NBA playoffs, but over the long term it isn't going to be a factor, just as when Raw is preempted in September for tennis. It may take a few weeks before it gets all its audience back, but eventually it will. While I enjoyed the A&E special, I thought the exclusion of Bruno Sammartino was a major error.
Also, Tom Burke should have been interviewed.
He's forgotten more about wrestling than Sheldon Goldberg knows.
Rich Kramer. Brick, New Jersey. Response from Dave Meltzer.
I don't know what Tom Burke knows in comparison to Sheldon Goldberg, but Goldberg seemed to have a far better grasp of wrestling history than the other so-called outside experts on that show.
I thought the A&E documentary was very well done. After being a wrestling fan for 12 years, I've been waiting for something like this. It was almost like seeing The Observer as a television special. There's one question I have that the show didn't answer.
When and where did tag team wrestling come along, and do you know who the first ever tag team champions were?
Travis Berry. Los Angeles, California. Response from Dave Meltzer.
I'm not sure of the origins of tag team wrestling, but would think there are people reading this who would know.
The wrestling promoter's worked story was that it was originated in Australia in the late 1800s, as even through the late 70s in many territories tag matches were referred to as Australian tag team matches, or matches under Australian rules or Australian style. That is believed to be just a colorful story created by a wrestling promoter. I believe tag teams started in the 1930s in either the South or the Midwest, although Luthez believes they may have started in Houston, which is where he ran across them the first time during the early part of World War II. At one point I recall Ron Welch Fuller claiming that his grandfather invented the tag team match in the mid-1930s. The first really famous tag team was the Dirty Dusek Riot Squad, four brothers from Omaha whose real last name was Hassan, who I believe would date back to the mid to late 1930s. Tag team wrestling got popular in the 1940s during World War II when the younger wrestlers were called to serve the country and wrestling had to survive on fewer and older and less conditioned wrestlers, so doing tag matches made it easier for them to do long matches. And by the 1950s, most territories had their own tag team champions. Maybe the most recognized of the early world tag team champions of the early 1950s would have been the Sharp brothers, Dan and Mike. Mike is the father of former 70s and 80s wrestler and occasional indie worker Mike Jr., who started their careers out of Hamilton, Ontario around 1940 and made it big around 1949 as a tag team out of San Francisco. In 1954, they were the original giant American heels that feuded with Rikidozan in the birth of Japanese pro wrestling. Although I've never seen a K1 event, live or taped, I was intrigued and excited that negotiations were in the works for K1 to be aired on ESPN starting this summer. From what I've read and learned about the organization, you've mentioned there were matches that you believe to be works. In fact, the organization seems to thrive in the realm of the work shoot, where it becomes very difficult to tell what is worked and what isn't. ESPN, at least today, would never air pro wrestling, even in a late night time slot, because it's not pure competition. Nor would its sister channel, ESPN2, which is known to be more eclectic and daring with its sports programming, especially later at night. Is ESPN aware of the potential work situation with K1, or has a she pulled the wool over ESPN's eyes? Or does ESPN perceive K1 to be like boxing, or at least if most of the matches are shoots, then it's acceptable to televise as a legitimate sporting contest? What is your recommendation for getting weekly access to Japanese wrestling? I assume that being on the West Coast you have a satellite feed to pick up Japanese wrestling. On a weekly basis, however, I read letters from readers in the Northeast who write intelligent, detailed letters on Japanese wrestlers, matches and promotions. These letters are written in such a knowledgeable fashion that it could only be by people who follow the respective promotions on a weekly basis. What is the best source to follow the Japanese scene? I realize there are various wrestling video distributors that carry Japanese wrestling. However, even the more reliable and credible distributors are usually anywhere from 3 to 6 months behind at best. Furthermore, it would cost a small fortune to continually order Japanese tapes on a weekly basis. Is there some vast underground network of bootleg tapes that makes its way across the country? What is your source? Can you please tell me what your personal vendetta is against Road Warrior Hawk? You seem to be exceptionally hard on everything he does in the ring. While I'll admit his interviews get increasingly embarrassing by the week, I can easily name 10 wrestlers whose work in the ring is worse and 10 more who are no better. I thought the A&E special was overall well done. It was surprising that they appeared to be more historically accurate with facts from the turn of the century than they were in covering things from the past 15 years. Considering how reputable A&E is, they should have done a lot better job of research on the Hogan-Andre segment. I think A&E failing to cover Bruno Sammartino and Ric Flair isn't as glaring an omission as some would think. Although I don't deny how important both of these wrestlers were to the industry, we must be reminded that this was a 2-hour show, and some names are inevitably going to be left out. Where A&E really missed out, which was totally negligent, is doing any type of brief segment on UFC. They could have ended the show saying how wrestling has gone full circle, with UFC and other shoot-style organizations showing that wrestling has returned to its roots from almost 100 years ago. As for Luthez, while I don't deny he was a legitimate shooter, if all of his matches were works, how were the promoters so sure he could handle himself with anyone in the ring he was paired up against in case a shoot developed? Was his reputation that firmly entrenched that nobody dared try to double-cross him, or when he wasn't doing worked matches, did he compete in shoot matches to keep his reputation alive? George Guida Jr. Stoneham, Massachusetts. Response from Dave Meltzer. K1, like Pancrase, has never acknowledged any worked matches on its part, and to the best of my knowledge, nobody from K1 has ever gone public on that subject. In Pancrase, Ken Shamrock did acknowledge in a radio interview that there was some element of working in Pancrase, as did Matt Hume, and several others have privately admitted it to me, although it is predominantly shooting. Besides, it would be very difficult to have a pure shooting sport in Japan, not impossible, but difficult, just because of cultural differences and because in Japan, how you play the game culturally is more important than winning and losing, which is diametrically opposed to America, which is why Americans have a terribly difficult time understanding why things happen the way they do in Japanese sports. Theoretically, both ESPN and the Nevada State Athletic Commission wouldn't want a sport that has been worked, but I would doubt they have proof of it, and there is going to be no proof, other than logic, which doesn't hold up without witnesses to back it up. Besides, pro boxing in this country is often worked, and so is tennis, when it comes to players intentionally tanking, which is part of that sport's terminology, and tanking and throwing a fight are exactly the same thing, and ESPN has no trouble with that, and you don't see governing bodies looking at shutting down tennis over situations that are obvious tanks.
SRS, which is a weekly show on combat sports in Japan which claims to only cover real sports as opposed to work sports, never covers traditional pro wrestling or rings, but gives a lot of coverage to both K1 and Pancrase.
Any man-against-man sport, particularly if it involves a small group of competitors who end up knowing each other well and the sport itself involves people who by the nature of the sport are going to have frequent injuries, is going to inherently have an element of potential working if only gentlemen's agreements to protect injuries.
As for Japanese tapes, the best source in any major city when it comes to the network shows, All Japan, New Japan, All Japan Women, are Japanese video stores, many of whom get tapes as soon as a few days after they air and usually charge only $1 or $2 for renting. If you live in a city without a Japanese video store, my best guess would be either get regular tapes from American tape dealers, and there are plenty of them, or try to work out a deal with a Japanese video store in your area to ship them. The cable shows, Michinoku, Rings, Pancrase, etc., I get from tape trading sources, which is why they usually lag several weeks behind when it comes to reviewing them. At this point, there is no Japanese wrestling available in the United States on satellite. Regarding A&E, while in a 2-hour show some names are going to be left out, it is still the equivalent of A doing a 2-hour show on the history of the NBA and leaving Chamberlain, Magic, Bird, and the existence of the ABA out of its history. Regarding UFC, the answer is that one can argue UFC isn't pro wrestling and doesn't claim to be pro wrestling, although one can argue that all it is pro wrestling that isn't worked as well. Pancrase and Rings, which are pro wrestling and are often real, are foreign, and they didn't cover anything foreign to begin with. But you're right in regard to a show that based so much of its emphasis on real versus fake, when that becomes the subject matter, at that point ignoring that there is stuff that is real around today is a glaring omission, but the entire piece limited the entire wrestling world to only WWF and WCW to begin with. I'd also have to say with real versus fake being that strong an emphasis, it's a glaring omission to ignore the Inoki Ali match. It was the biggest match in the world in terms of hype, news value, money, and long-term historical significance of the decade of the 70s, and in terms of money and a match that made worldwide news, it may have been the biggest pro wrestling match ever up to that point in time. Even though it took place in Japan, it was major news in the US and was closed-circuited around the country as part of pro wrestling cards. It was real, it had a colorful story, and Ali, who was a worldwide sports figure makes Hogan look like nothing, was a participant. As for Thez, he garnered a reputation from being well-trained in submissions, which really exceedingly few pro wrestlers in any time period had an extensive knowledge of. While Thez had few if any shoots in actual public competition, he used to train with the top wrestlers and was always in condition, and he had garnered quite a reputation within pro wrestling for what he was capable of. Thez himself at one point mentioned to me that because of his teachers and because of his reputation, maybe that contributed to the fact that few were eager to test him out. And the promoters clearly had confidence in him because there was never a period where there was a movement to take the title from him because of fear someone might steal it from him. When the Buddy Rogers problem cropped up, the NWO promoters called Thez, who was in semi-retirement at the time and was 46 years old as opposed to any active younger competitor at the time, and there were people at the time who big names and also tough guys, to return to full-time competition because of the belief that if anything underhanded would be attempted, that Thez in the ring would be able to cure that problem. Let's face it, when it comes to situations that can build up to a real fight, a good bluff that keeps the fight from ever taking place is usually more effective than a good right.